The whip cracked through the morning air, tearing flesh from bone as Daniel Harper bit down on leather to keep from screaming. 29 lashes had already painted the post crimson, but it wasn't the pain that haunted him. It was knowing that tomorrow the Lakota girl he'd saved would learn he'd taken this punishment for her. What Daniel didn't know was that Chief Iron Wolf was already riding toward the fort with an offer that would shake both worlds his daughter's hand in marriage. Watch till the end and comment your city below. Let me see how far this story travels. The August sun hammered down on Fort Laramie like the fist of an angry god, baking the parade ground until the air shimmered with heat mirages that made the distant mountains dance. Private Daniel Harper stood at attention with the rest of Company B, sweat trickling down his spine beneath the heavy wool uniform that seemed designed to torture soldiers in this godforsaken heat. At 23, Daniel had the lean build of a horseman and the calloused hands of someone who'd grown up working his family's failing farm in Ohio before the Army promised him 3 square meals and $13 a month. He'd been at Fort Laramie for 8 months now, long enough to understand that the real enemy wasn't always the one carrying a tomahawk. Sometimes it wore the same blue uniform you did. "At ease, men," barked Sergeant McKenna, a thick-necked Irishman whose face had been carved by 20 years of frontier service into something resembling weathered leather. "Supply wagons coming in. Harrison Mitchell Kowalski, you're on unloading duty. The rest of you dismissed until evening drill." Daniel started to turn when he heard it, laughter, but not the good kind. It was the sort of harsh, predatory sound that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He'd heard that particular brand of laughter before, usually right before something terrible happened. The sound was coming from behind the quartermaster's building, where the shade offered respite from the brutal sun. Daniel hesitated. It wasn't his business. He'd learned that lesson the hard way when he'd tried to intervene in a card game gone violent his second week at the fort. Lieutenant Morrison had made it abundantly clear that privates who didn't mind their own business found themselves on latrine duty for a month. But then he heard something else, a girl's voice high and frightened, speaking words he didn't understand, but in a tone that needed no translation. Daniel's feet were moving before his brain caught up. He rounded the corner to find 3 soldiers he recognized from Company D Corporal Briggs and privates, Tomlin and Garrett. They had someone cornered against the building's rough wooden wall, and Daniel's stomach dropped when he saw who it was. The girl couldn't have been more than 16 or 17 with the high cheekbones and dark eyes that marked her as Lakota. She wore a doe-skin dress decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the light, and her long black hair was woven into 2 braids that hung past her waist. She was clutching a woven basket that had spilled its contents wild berries that now stained the dusty ground purple. "Come on now, don't be unfriendly," Briggs was saying, his words slurred with midday whiskey. The corporal was a mean drunk on his best days, and Daniel could smell the alcohol from 10 feet away. "We're just trying to be hospitable to our visitor." "She's from the peaceful band that trades with us," Tomlin added, reaching out to touch one of her braids. The girl flinched back, pressing harder against the wall. "Ain't that right, sweetheart? You understand English, don't you?" "Please," the girl said, and that single word in accented English made Daniel's decision for him. "I go now. My father—" "Your father ain't here," Garrett interrupted, moving to block her path when she tried to sidestep them. "And we're just having a little fun. No harm in that." Daniel cleared his throat loudly. "Leave her alone." 3 heads turned toward him in unison, and Briggs's bloodshot eyes narrowed. "Well, well, if it isn't Private Harper, the conscience of Fort Laramie. This ain't your concern, farm boy." "You're drunk, Corporal," Daniel said, keeping his voice steady, even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "And you're scaring her. Let her go." Briggs laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You giving me orders now, Private? Maybe you forgot how rank works in the Army." "I haven't forgotten anything to," Daniel replied, taking a step closer. The girl's eyes darted between him and her tormentors, hope and fear warring in her expression. "But I'm pretty sure Colonel Winters wouldn't appreciate you harassing the daughter of a chief we're trying to maintain peaceful relations with." That gave them pause. The fort's commander was notorious for his harsh discipline, especially when it came to incidents that might spark conflict with the local tribes. They'd all heard about what happened to the soldiers at Fort Phil Kearny who'd provoked an attack through their stupidity. "You don't know she's anybody important," Tomlin said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Daniel took another step forward. Look at her dress. That beadwork isn't common. It's ceremonial. She's somebody's daughter, somebody who matters. He had no idea if this was true, but he'd learned that confidence could sell almost any lie. You want to explain to the colonel why the peace talks fell apart because you couldn't keep your hands to yourself. For a moment, the tableau held 3 drunk soldiers, one frightened girl, and Daniel standing between them like a thin blue line. Then Briggs spat in the dust. You're making a mistake, Harper. This little savage isn't worth... The word hadn't fully left his mouth when Daniel's fist connected with his jaw. It wasn't a conscious decision, his body simply acted on pure instinct and rage. Briggs went down hard, his head striking the corner of the building with a sound like a melon dropping. Everything went still. Tomlin and Garrett stared at their unconscious corporal, then at Daniel, whose hand was already beginning to swell. The girl remained frozen against the wall, her eyes wide with shock. You just struck a superior officer, Garrett whispered. That's a court-martial offense. Daniel's stomach turned to ice water as the reality of what he had done crashed over him. Striking a superior officer wasn't just a court-martial offense. It could mean prison discharge and disgrace, or worse. But when he looked at the girl still trembling against the wall, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Go, he told her, gesturing toward the fort's entrance. Run, now. She didn't need to be told twice. Gathering her scattered dignity along with a handful of the spilled berries, she fled without looking back. Daniel watched her disappear around the corner, her moccasins silent on the packed earth. You're done, Harper, Tomlin said, kneeling beside Briggs, who was beginning to groan. When he wakes up, you're finished. Daniel knew he was right. There would be no explaining this away, no excuse that would satisfy military justice. He'd thrown away his career, possibly his freedom, for a girl whose name he didn't even know. 2 hours later, he was in irons. The court-martial convened the next morning in the fort's main building, a stark room that smelled of pipe tobacco and boot polish. Daniel stood at attention before a panel of 5 officers, his wrists still bearing the marks of the shackles they'd removed only minutes before. Colonel Winters presided, his gray beard and stern expression making him look like an Old Testament prophet about to pronounce judgment. Private Daniel Harper. The colonel began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. You stand accused of striking a superior officer, Corporal Marcus Briggs, without provocation. How do you plead? Daniel's throat was dry as sand. His appointed defender, a young lieutenant named Peterson, had advised him to plead not guilty and claim Briggs had been drunk and disorderly. But Daniel had seen enough of military justice to know that the word of a private meant nothing against that of a corporal, drunk or not. Guilty, sir. A murmur ran through the assembled soldiers who had been ordered to witness the proceedings. Colonel Winters' expression didn't change. Corporal Briggs, the colonel said, turning to where Briggs sat with a spectacular purple bruise decorating his jaw. State your version of events. Briggs stood swaying slightly, whether from yesterday's whiskey or the blow to his head, Daniel couldn't tell. Sir, I was conducting a routine inspection of the quartermaster's area when Private Harper approached me in an aggressive manner. When I attempted to correct his behavior, he struck me without warning. Were there witnesses? Privates Tomlin and Garrett were present, sir. Both men were called forward and corroborated Briggs's version of events, though Daniel noticed neither of them would meet his eyes. There was no mention of the girl, no mention of the harassment. In their telling, Daniel had simply walked up and assaulted a superior officer for no reason at all. Private Harper. Colonel Winters said, Do you have anything to say in your defense? Daniel straightened his spine. He could tell the truth, but what good would it do? It would be his word against 3 others, and even if they believed him, striking a superior officer was still a court-martial offense, regardless of the circumstances. The girl was safe. That was what mattered. No, sir, I accept responsibility for my actions. The colonel studied him for a long moment, and Daniel had the uncomfortable feeling that those sharp gray eyes saw more than he was saying. But military protocol was military protocol. Very well. Private Daniel Harper, this court finds you guilty of striking a superior officer. Under normal circumstances, this would warrant immediate discharge and imprisonment. He paused, and Daniel's heart seemed to stop. However, given your previously exemplary record and your willingness to accept responsibility, this court sentences you to 30 lashes to be administered publicly at dawn tomorrow. You will forfeit 3 months' pay and be reduced in rank to, well, you're already a private, so that's where you'll stay. 30 lashes. Daniel had seen men take 20 and be unable to walk for a week. 30 could kill a man if the person wielding the whip was zealous enough. Furthermore, the colonel continued, you will be confined to quarters until your punishment is administered. This court is adjourned. As the guards led him away, Daniel caught a glimpse of Briggs's smirking face. The corporal raised his hand to his bruised jaw in a mock salute, his eyes promising that this wasn't over. That night, Daniel lay on the hard bunk in the stockade, staring at the ceiling and wondering if he'd survive the morning. The doctor had come by earlier, a gruff but kind man named Holcomb, who'd seen too much suffering on the frontier to maintain any illusions about human nature. 30 lashes, Holcomb had said, shaking his head. I'll have laudanum ready, but it won't help much. The best advice I can give you is to bite down on something and try to go somewhere else in your mind. Will I? Daniel couldn't finish the question. Survive. Probably. Men have taken worse and lived, but you'll carry the scars for the rest of your life. The doctor had paused at the cell door. What you did, was it worth it? Daniel thought of the girl's terrified eyes, of the way she'd fled to safety. Yes, Holcomb had nodded slowly. Then hold on to that tomorrow. Sometimes the why is all that gets us through the how. Sleep was impossible. Daniel spent the hours thinking about his family back in Ohio, wondering what they'd think when they learned of his disgrace. His mother would weep. His father would rage about the shame brought upon the Harper name. His younger brother would probably be forbidden to mention his name again. When the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the barred window, Daniel heard footsteps approaching. It was time. They led him out to the parade ground where it seemed the entire fort had assembled. 200 men stood in formation, their faces carefully neutral. In the center of the ground stood the whipping post, a thick wooden pillar worn smooth by years of use with iron rings set at head height. Daniel was marched to the post, his shirt stripped away to expose his back to the morning chill. The guard secured his wrists to the rings, stretching his arms up until he had to stand on his toes. Someone, he thought it was the doctor, pressed a piece of thick leather between his teeth. Bite down, Holcomb whispered, and remember why. Colonel Winters read the charges again, his voice carrying across the silent assembly. Then he nodded to the man holding the whip. Sergeant McKenna, Daniel realized with a sinking heart. Of course they'd chosen the strongest man in the fort. 30 lashes for striking a superior officer, some, the colonel announced. Sergeant, proceed. The first lash fell like a line of fire across Daniel's shoulders. He bit down hard on the leather, his body jerking against the restraints. The second followed quickly, slightly lower, and Daniel understood with horrible clarity that McKenna knew exactly what he was doing, each stroke placed precisely to inflict maximum pain without overlapping. By the 10th lash, Daniel's back was a sheet of agony. Blood ran down to soak into his trousers. His legs shook with the effort of staying upright. By the 15th, he was screaming into the leather, all pretense of stoicism abandoned. By the 20th, the edges of his vision had gone gray, and he could no longer feel individual strokes. His entire back had become one massive wound. He was dimly aware of voices of movement in the crowd, but the pain had become his entire world. Each breath was torture, as his ravaged muscles tried to expand his ribcage. The leather strap fell from his mouth, and he tasted blood where he'd bitten through his own tongue. 25, someone counted, and Daniel wondered if 5 more would kill him. Part of him hoped they would. That's when the crowd's murmur changed, shifting from the subdued witnessing of punishment to something else, surprise alarm. Daniel forced his eyes open, trying to focus through the haze of agony. 3 riders had entered the fort. They came through the main gate as if they belonged there, their horses moving at an unhurried walk that suggested either complete confidence or complete indifference to the 200 armed soldiers surrounding them. The man in the center sat his horse like he'd been born in the saddle, his bearing erect, despite his obvious age. His hair was iron gray streaked with white, worn long, and adorned with eagle feathers. His face was weathered and proud, with the kind of deep-set eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. Daniel knew even through his pain-addled haze that this was someone important. The elaborate beadwork on the man's shirt, the way the two younger warriors flanking him maintained a respectful distance, the quality of his horse, everything marked him as a chief. Colonel Winters raised his hand and McKenna paused with the whip pulled back for the 26th stroke. "Hold," the colonel ordered. He stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively to his sidearm before he caught himself. "Chief Ironwolf. This is unexpected." Ironwolf. Daniel had heard the name. He was one of the Lakota chiefs who'd agreed to peaceful relations with the fort, a pragmatist who'd decided that trade was preferable to war. He was also, if the stories were true, a formidable warrior who'd counted coup on more enemies than most soldiers had seen. The chief dismounted with surprising grace for his age, and his two companions followed suit. He walked forward until he stood directly in front of Colonel Winters, close enough that Daniel could see his face clearly, despite the blood loss making everything swim in and out of focus. "Colonel," Ironwolf said in accented but clear English, "I come to speak of this man." He gestured toward Daniel, still bound to the whipping post. "This is a military matter, Chief," Winters replied carefully. "Private Harper struck a superior officer. He's being punished according to our law." "Your law." Ironwolf's expression didn't change, but something in his tone made several soldiers shift nervously. "I know of your law, but I also know of honor. This man, he protected one who could not protect herself. My daughter has told me what he did." The parade ground went absolutely silent. Daniel's pain-fogged brain tried to process this. The girl she'd been Ironwolf's daughter, your daughter. Colonel Winters' voice had taken on a different quality, still authoritative but now tinged with concern. An incident with a random Lakota girl was one thing. An incident with the daughter of a chief they were trying to maintain peace with was something else entirely. "Ayanna," Ironwolf said. "She came to trade berries for cloth. Your soldiers—" He paused, his gaze finding Briggs in the crowd. "They dishonored themselves, and would have dishonored her. This man stopped them." "I was not made aware of these circumstances," the colonel said slowly, and his own gaze found Briggs, who had gone pale beneath his bruise. "Would it have mattered?" Ironwolf asked. "Your law says a warrior cannot strike his chief, yes, even if that chief acts without honor." It was a question that cut to the heart of military justice, and Daniel saw the colonel struggle with it. But before he could answer, Ironwolf continued, "I did not come to challenge your law. I came to honor courage." He walked past the colonel, approaching the whipping post where Daniel hung. Up close, Daniel could see the intricate scars on the chief's arms marks of the sun, dance the most sacred and painful ritual of the Lakota. "You took the lash rather than speak of my daughter's shame," Ironwolf said quietly, speaking directly to Daniel now. "You protected her honor with your silence and your blood. This is not the way of a soldier. It is the way of a warrior." Daniel tried to speak, but his throat was too raw from screaming. Ironwolf studied his ravaged back, then turned to face Colonel Winters again. "I asked for time to speak with my people before you continue. This is not just punishment now, it is something greater." The colonel was clearly out of his depth. This had transformed from a simple disciplinary action into a diplomatic incident. "Chief Ironwolf, I respect your position, but military justice must be completed. He has 5 more lashes to receive." "Then he will receive them," Ironwolf said. "But first, I would speak with my warriors. Grant me this colonel, and I will remember it when next we discuss the treaties between our peoples." It was masterfully done, not quite a threat, but a clear reminder of how much the fort depended on peaceful relations with Ironwolf's band. The colonel nodded slowly. "Sergeant McKenna, stand down. We will resume in 1 hour." The next hour was perhaps worse than the whipping itself. They left Daniel bound to the post, his ravaged back exposed to the morning sun and the flies that had already begun to gather. Dr. Holcomb was permitted to give him water, but nothing else. The punishment had to be completed before any real medical treatment could begin. Ironwolf and his warriors had withdrawn to just outside the fort's walls, where Daniel could see them in intense discussion. Ayanna was there too. She must have been waiting with the horses. Even from a distance, Daniel could see her gesturing animatedly, apparently arguing with her father about something. The soldiers, meanwhile, were buzzing with speculation. The story of what had really happened behind the quartermaster's building spread like wildfire, and Daniel noticed the looks being directed at Briggs were no longer friendly. Striking a superior officer was one thing every soldier understood, that discipline had to be maintained. But lying about it, letting another man take a punishment that severe while hiding the real circumstances, that was something else. You should have told the truth, Lieutenant Peterson said quietly, having approached while Daniel drifted in and out of consciousness. This changes everything. Daniel managed to croak out, wouldn't have mattered. Maybe not for the verdict, but the sentence might have been lighter. The young officer looked troubled. 30 lashes for defending a girl's honor, that's not justice. It's Army. Justice, Daniel managed, and Peterson had no answer for that. When the hour was up, Iron Wolf returned, but he wasn't alone. Ayanna walked beside him, and Daniel's pain-addled brain noticed she had changed clothes. Where before she'd worn a simple dress now, she was adorned in what was obviously ceremonial garb, white doe skin, covered in elaborate beadwork strings of shells that chimed softly as she moved her hair rebraided with feathers and colored cloth. She looked, Daniel realized with a start, like a bride. "Colonel," Iron Wolf announced, his voice carrying across the parade ground, "I have spoken with my daughter and my warriors. We have decided. This man will receive his remaining lashes. Your law must be satisfied. But when it is done, I would make him an offer." "What kind of offer?" the colonel asked suspiciously. "The kind that comes only once in a lifetime," Iron Wolf replied. "But first, your justice. Complete it." The colonel nodded to McKenna, who picked up the whip again with obvious reluctance. The 5 remaining lashes fell on Daniel's already destroyed back, and this time he didn't even try to hold back his screams. Darkness crept in from the edges of his vision, and he was only dimly aware when the final stroke fell. "It is done," Colonel Winters announced. "Cut him down." Rough hands freed Daniel's wrists, and he collapsed immediately, his legs unable to support him. Dr. Holcomb was there, instantly pressing a cloth soaked in something that smelled of alcohol and herbs against the worst of the wounds. But Iron Wolf waved the doctor back. "Let him stand on his own if he can. A warrior should hear his fate on his feet." It took everything Daniel had left, but somehow he managed to get his knees under him, then slowly, agonizingly push himself upright. He swayed dangerously, and Lieutenant Peterson moved to steady him, but Daniel waved him off. If he was going to face whatever came next, he'd do it standing. Iron Wolf nodded approvingly. "You have strength. Good. You will need it for what I offer." He paused, seeming to gather himself for something momentous. "My daughter tells me that in 3 minutes of courage, you showed her the heart of the man she has prayed to the spirits to send her. She says you acted not as a white soldier protecting a Lakota girl, but as a man protecting a woman. For this, she wishes to offer herself as your wife." The parade ground erupted. Soldiers exclaimed in shock, officers barked for silence, and somewhere behind him Daniel heard Briggs cursing violently. But Daniel himself stood frozen, certain he'd misheard, or that the pain had finally driven him mad. "You're offering marriage?" Colonel Winters sounded as stunned as Daniel felt. "I offer more than that, Jim," Iron Wolf said. "I offer kinship. If this man accepts, he becomes not just husband to Ayanna, but son to me. He joins the Lakota, becomes one of our people. But," and here his expression grew serious, "he must choose. He cannot be both soldier and Lakota. If he accepts, he must leave your army, leave this fort, leave his old life completely." "That's desertion," the colonel said flatly. "I can't permit—" "With respect, Colonel," Iron Wolf interrupted, "can you stop it? If he chooses to walk out of this fort with us, will you order your men to shoot him? After what all have learned today. After he has already paid in blood for protecting my daughter. It was a masterful trap." The colonel couldn't openly condone desertion, but neither could he order his men to shoot a man who'd just taken 30 lashes for protecting an innocent girl, not without risking a complete breakdown of morale, possibly even mutiny. "The choice must be his," Iron Wolf continued. "But it must be made now. My daughter has made her offer. She will not make it again." All eyes turned to Daniel. He stood there, blood still running down his back, trying to process what was happening. Marriage to a chief's daughter, becoming Lakota, leaving everything he'd known behind. He looked at Ayanna, who had remained silent through all of this. She met his gaze steadily, and in her dark eyes he saw no fear now, only determination and something else, something that made his heart race despite the pain. "Why?" he managed to ask her directly. "You don't know me." She stepped forward, and when she spoke her English was careful but clear. "I know you chose pain over dishonor. I know you asked for nothing after. I know you did not speak my shame even to save yourself. This tells me everything. But I'm—" Daniel gestured weakly at himself, white soldier, enemy of her people for generations. "You are a man who acted with honor," she said simply. "Color does not change this. Uniform does not change this." "The fort's full of men," someone called out from the crowd. Briggs Daniel realized. "Why choose him?" Ayanna turned toward the voice, and her expression could have frozen fire. "Because he is the only one who did not stand by. He is the only one who saw wrong and acted even knowing the cost." She looked back at Daniel. "The spirits tell us that the measure of a man is not in his words but in his choices. When choosing costs everything. You have been measured. You have been found worthy." Daniel's head spun, and not just from blood loss. He looked around at the assembled soldiers, men he'd served with, eaten with, fought alongside. He saw Lieutenant Peterson's conflicted expression, Dr. Holcomb's concerned frown, Sergeant McKenna's grudging respect. He saw Briggs's fury and the shame on Tomlin's and Garrett's faces. Then he looked at Colonel Winters, who stood rigid with the weight of command and the impossibility of the situation. "If I say yes," Daniel said slowly, "what happens?" "You come with us now," Iron Wolf said. "You become Lakota. You learn our ways, our language, our customs. You marry my daughter according to our traditions. You never return to this life. And if I say no, then you remain here. You heal. You continue as a soldier. My daughter returns home, and we speak of this no more." But Daniel could read between the lines. If he stayed, Briggs would make his life hell. The story would follow him, the private who went native, who chose a savage over his own kind. He'd be transferred, probably sent to some hard-scrabble post where men who embarrassed the army were forgotten. More than that, though, he looked at Ayanna and saw a possibility, saw a chance for something different, something that transcended the endless cycle of violence and mistrust between their peoples. "My back needs treatment," he said, addressing Dr. Holcomb. "Without it, I could die from infection." The doctor nodded. "That's true. Those wounds need cleaning, stitching, daily care for at least a week." "Our healers know their work," Iron Wolf said. "We have treated worse wounds than these." It was the moment of decision. Daniel drew in a breath that sent fire across his ravaged back and made his choice. "I accept." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before chaos erupted. Soldiers shouted in disbelief, officers demanded order, and somewhere a bugle sounded, though for what purpose Daniel couldn't imagine. "You can't—" Briggs pushed through the crowd, his face purple with rage. "Colonel, you can't let him—" "Corporal Briggs!" The colonel's voice cut through the noise like a saber. "You will be silent. In fact, you will report to my office immediately after this assembly is dismissed. We have much to discuss about your version of yesterday's events." Briggs paled but subsided. Colonel Winters approached Daniel, his expression unreadable. "Private Harper, or whatever you choose to call yourself now, I cannot officially condone this. You understand that?" "Yes, sir." "Unofficially—" The colonel paused, seeming to weigh his words. "Unofficially, I hope you find whatever peace you're looking for." He turned to Iron Wolf. "He's free to go with you. But understand, once he leaves these gates, he cannot return. The army will consider him dead to us." "He will be reborn as Lakota," Iron Wolf replied. "This is fair." What happened next would be burned into Daniel's memory forever, though the pain and blood loss made it seem almost dreamlike. Ayanna approached him, carrying something in her hands, a beautifully beaded shirt, soft deer hide, decorated with patterns he didn't understand but recognized as significant. "This was made for my husband," she said quietly. "I began it 3 moons ago when the spirits told me he would come. It is yours now." With gentle hands, far gentler than anyone had touched him since the whipping began, she helped him into the shirt. The soft hide was agony against his wounds, but somehow also cooling, and he caught the scent of some kind of herb that seemed to ease the fire in his back. Iron Wolf produced a pipe. Not just any pipe, Daniel realized, but a ceremonial one, decorated with feathers and carved with symbols. The chief lit it with great ceremony, took a draw, and then offered it to Daniel. "Smoke," he said. "Seal the bond." Daniel had never smoked anything stronger than the occasional cigarette, but he took the pipe and drew in the smoke. It was harsh and sweet at once, and seemed to fill not just his lungs but his entire being with a strange lightness. "It is done," Iron Wolf announced. "He is no longer Daniel Harper soldier. He is Wikasa Teka new man. He comes with us to begin again." Two of Iron Wolf's warriors stepped forward to help Daniel walk. Each step was agony, but he forced himself to move to leave the parade ground under his own power, or at least mostly his own power. As they passed through the crowd of soldiers, men reached out to touch his shoulder to nod their respect. Even some who'd called him fool moments before seemed moved by the dignity of his exit. Lieutenant Peterson stepped forward as they neared the gate. "Harper Daniel, wait." He pulled something from his pocket, a small leather journal. "Take this. Maybe write down what happens, so someone knows." Daniel accepted the journal with his one free hand, nodding his thanks. Dr. Holcomb appeared with a medical kit. "For the wound," he said, pressing it into Ayana's hands. "The instructions are simple enough. Clean them twice daily, apply the salve, keep them covered. And," he pulled out a bottle of laudanum for the pain when it becomes too much. "Thank you," Ayana said softly. "You are a good man." "I'm a doctor," Holcomb replied gruffly. "I took an oath to do no harm. Seems like that extends to making sure men who protect innocents don't die from their wounds no matter whose care they're under." They were at the gate now. Beyond lay the vast prairie, the Lakota camp somewhere in the distance. Daniel turned back one last time, looking at Fort Laramie, the place that had been his home, his prison, his site of transformation. Colonel Winters stood on the parade ground watching. He raised his hand in what might have been a salute or might have been a farewell. Daniel couldn't lift his arm to return it, but he nodded deeply. Then he turned away from his old life and walked into his new one. The journey to the Lakota camp was a blur of pain and strange sensations. They'd brought a travois, a kind of stretcher pulled by a horse, and after the first mile, Daniel's pride gave way to necessity, and he allowed them to help him onto it. Lying on his stomach to spare his back, he watched the fort grow smaller and smaller until it vanished entirely behind a rise. Ayana rode beside him, occasionally reaching down to touch his hand to assure herself or him that this was real. She spoke to him in a mixture of English and Lakota, teaching him simple words. Water was mani au, thank you, was pilamaya, pain, was wazan. "Your name," she said at one point, "Wikasa Teka. It means new man. My father chose it. You are new to us, but also you are made new by your choice." "What do I call you?" Daniel asked, his voice rough. "I am Ayana. It means eternal flower in our language." She smiled slightly. "My mother said I was as stubborn as a flower that blooms even through rocks. I think she meant it as warning, but my father took it as good sign." "And your mother?" "She walks with the spirits now. 3 winters past." Ayana's expression grew distant. "She would have liked you, I think. She always said that courage speaks in all languages." The camp, when they finally reached it, was nothing like Daniel had expected. He'd seen Lakota camps from a distance, clusters of teepees that looked small and temporary. But up close, he realized this was a thriving community. Children ran between the lodges, women worked at various tasks, men tended to horses and weapons. It was organized, purposeful, alive. Their arrival caused a stir. People emerged from teepees to stare at the white man on the travois. Bloodied and barely conscious, being brought in by their chief like some strange prize of war. Iron Wolf dismounted in front of a large teepee decorated with painted horses and geometric designs. "This is my lodge," he announced loudly enough for all to hear. "This man is under my protection. He has chosen to become one of us to marry my daughter. Any who challenge this challenge me." An older woman emerged from the teepee, iron-haired, sharp-eyed, with the kind of bearing that suggested she was someone of importance. She looked at Daniel with an expression he couldn't read, then at Ayana, then at Iron Wolf. So, she said in English clearly for Daniel's benefit, this is the one who took the lash rather than speak of shame. This is him, grandmother, Ayanna said, and Daniel realized this must be Iron Wolf's mother, a matriarch of significant standing, judging by the deference everyone showed her. The old woman approached the travois, studying Daniel's face, then carefully lifting the edge of his shirt to examine his wounds. She made a sound that might have been approval or disgust, Daniel couldn't tell. He will live, she announced, but he will wish he wouldn't for the next few days. Bring him inside. I will need hot water, clean cloth, and my medicine bundle. Yana, you will help. If he is to be your husband, you must learn to tend his wounds. He seems the type to collect them. They carried Daniel into the teepee, which was surprisingly spacious inside. The ground was covered with soft furs, and a small fire burned in the center, its smoke drawn up through the opening at the top. They laid him carefully on a bed of buffalo robes, and the grandmother immediately set to work. What followed was perhaps worse than the whipping itself. She cleaned each wound with something that burned like liquid fire, picking out bits of fabric and dirt with a thoroughness that was medically necessary but agonizing to endure. Daniel bit down on a piece of leather again and tried to focus on Ayanna's voice as she spoke to him softly in Lakota, the musical syllables washing over him like water. My grandmother is the best healer in 7 bands, she told him, when the old woman stepped away to prepare some kind of poultice. She has seen worse than this and healed it. You will have scars, but you will heal strong. Scars don't matter, Daniel managed to gasp out. No, Ayanna agreed. They are marks of honor among our people. These especially scars earned protecting someone who could not protect herself. The warriors will respect them. The grandmother returned with a bowl of something that looked like green mud but smelled of pine and sage. She began applying it to his wounds, and miraculously it seemed to cool the fire in his back. This one is strong, the grandmother said to Ayanna in English, though she continued to look at Daniel. But strength of body is not enough. He must learn our ways, our language, our customs. This will be harder than healing from the whip. I'll learn, Daniel said, though speaking took effort. The grandmother's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. We will see. Many white men say they will learn. Few do. But then, she looked at his back again. Few would take 30 lashes for a Lakota girl they didn't know. Perhaps you are different. Over the next days, Daniel existed in a haze of fever and pain. The wounds became infected despite the grandmother's best efforts, or perhaps she said because of the filth of the fort where he'd received them. He burned and shivered, alternately lost in deliriums, where he was back at the whipping post or facing his father's disappointment or watching Ayanna be dragged away by laughing soldiers. Through it all, Ayanna stayed with him. She bathed his forehead with cool water when the fever spiked, held him down, when he thrashed in his sleep, sang to him in Lakota, when he cried out. Later he would learn that this was unusual. Unmarried Lakota women did not typically tend to men who were not family, but Iron Wolf had declared him family to be, and that was enough to bend the rules. On the 4th day the fever broke. Daniel woke to find himself clear-headed for the first time since the whipping. Sunlight filtered through the teepee walls, creating a warm golden glow, and he could hear the normal sounds of camp life outside children. Laughing, dogs barking, the steady rhythm of someone scraping a hide. Ayanna was there grinding something in a stone bowl. She looked up when he stirred, and her face lit up with relief. You are back, she said simply. Was I gone? For 3 days you walked with the spirits. Grandmother said they were deciding whether to take you or send you back. She set aside the bowl and moved closer. I am glad they sent you back. So am I, Daniel said, and meant it. He tried to sit up, winced, and thought better of it. How bad is it? You will heal. The infection is gone. The wounds close cleanly now, but you will not be riding horses or lifting anything heavy for another moon at least. A moon a month. Daniel processed this, realized he was already starting to think in their terms rather than his own. What happens now? He asked. Now you heal, you learn, and when you are strong enough, we marry. She said it matter-of-factly, but Daniel caught the slight blush that colored her cheeks. Ayanna, he said carefully, why did you really choose this? You could have any warrior you wanted. She was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer. Do you know what it is like to be the chief's daughter? Every man who looks at me sees power, sees connection to my father. They see what I can bring them, not who I am. She moved to the teepee entrance, looking out at the camp. But you didn't know who I was. You saw just a girl in danger and acted, not for gain, not for recognition, but because it was right. And then when you could have saved yourself by telling the truth, you chose silence to protect my honor. She turned back to him. In my life, I have seen many men speak of honor. I have seen few act with it when acting costs them everything. You showed me your heart in those moments, and it was a heart worth choosing. Before Daniel could respond, Iron Wolf entered the teepee. The chief looked older in the daylight, more careworn, but his eyes were sharp as ever. You live, he observed. Good. We have much to discuss. He sat cross-legged beside Daniel's pallet, his movements still graceful despite his years. You must understand what you have chosen. Becoming Lakota is not just changing your clothes and learning our words. It is becoming a different person entirely. I understand, Daniel said, though he wasn't sure he truly did. No, you don't, Iron Wolf said, not unkindly. But you will. First, you must understand why I agreed to this. My daughter is precious to me, my only surviving child. 3 sons I lost to war with the whites, 1 daughter to the coughing sickness. Ayanna is all that remains of my bloodline. Daniel heard the weight of grief in those words, the kind of loss that shaped a man forever. When she told me what happened at the fort, my first thought was war, to attack to take revenge. But I am old now, and I have seen too much war. I have seen what it brings: more death, more loss, more grieving fathers. He paused, studying Daniel's face. Then she told me of you, the white soldier who fought his own kind for her, who took the lash rather than shame her. And I thought perhaps here is a different path. A path, Daniel asked. You are white, but you will be Lakota. Any children you have with Ayanna will be both. Perhaps in time this will help our peoples understand each other. Perhaps not. But it is better than more war. It was a heavy burden to place on a marriage, Daniel thought, but he understood the chief's reasoning. He was not just gaining a husband for his daughter, but hoping for a bridge between worlds. There will be those who resist, Iron Wolf continued. Some among my people will see you as an enemy always. Some will test you, challenge you. You must be ready. And at the fort, they will call you traitor. If you are caught by the army, they may hang you for desertion. Iron Wolf's expression was grave. This is not a choice you can take back. You must be certain. Daniel thought of the life he'd left behind, the routine, the discipline, the certainty of knowing his place, even if that place was at the bottom. Then he looked at Ayanna, at the way the light caught in her dark hair, at the strength and kindness in her eyes. I'm certain, he said. Iron Wolf nodded slowly. Then we begin. When you can walk, you will start learning. Our language first. You cannot be Lakota without speaking as we do. Then our customs, our prayers, our ways of hunting and fighting. You will have teachers. Who? My nephew Dakota. He is young but patient, speaks English well. He will be your guide. And Ayanna, of course. A man should learn first from his wife-to-be. Over the next weeks, Daniel's education began. As soon as he could sit up without agony, Dakota, a cheerful young man, perhaps 18 years old, began visiting daily for language lessons. Lakota was unlike any language Daniel had encountered, with sounds that didn't exist in English and a completely different way of constructing thoughts. You think like a white man still, Dakota would say, laughing when Daniel tried to translate English sentences word for word. Lakota does not work this way. We speak from the heart outward, not from the head down. It was frustrating, humiliating at times to struggle with words children could speak fluently. But Daniel persevered, driven by the way Ayanna's face lit up when he managed a complete sentence correctly, by the approving nods from Iron Wolf when he remembered the proper greeting for an elder. The physical healing was easier than the cultural transformation. His back, though scarred horrifically, began to knit together under the grandmother's care. She had him drinking foul-tasting teas that she swore would prevent the scars from limiting his movement, and gradually he found he could turn, reach, even carefully stretch, without the pulling agony of the first weeks. The first snow came early that year, dusting the prairie in white, just as Daniel took his first steps outside the teepee without assistance. His legs trembled like a newborn colt's, but he remained upright, breathing in the sharp winter air that seemed to cut through his lungs with crystalline clarity. 6 weeks had passed since Iron Wolf had carried him from Fort Laramie, and in that time the world had transformed around him in ways he was only beginning to understand. "You walk like a baby buffalo," Dakota observed from where he sat working on a bow, his voice carrying the gentle mockery that Daniel had learned was a sign of acceptance among the Lakota. "All wobble, no grace." "Give him time," Ayanna said, appearing at Daniel's elbow to steady him. Her presence had become as natural as breathing over these weeks of recovery. Even Buffalo learned to run. Daniel wanted to tell her he could manage alone, but the truth was, her support, both physical and otherwise, was the only thing keeping him from collapsing back onto the furs. The scarring on his back had tightened as it healed, making every movement feel like his skin might tear apart. The grandmother had warned him about this, had shown him stretching exercises that hurt worse than the original wounds, but she promised they would restore his flexibility if he persevered. "The council meets tonight," Iron Wolf announced, emerging from his morning prayers. The chief's expression was unreadable, but Daniel had learned to recognize the tension in his shoulders that meant difficult decisions ahead. "They will discuss your place among us." Daniel's stomach tightened. He'd known this was coming, the formal acceptance or rejection by the band's council of elders. While Iron Wolf's word carried enormous weight, the Lakota were not ruled by a single voice. The council would debate, and their decision would determine whether Daniel could truly marry Ayanna, or whether he would be cast out to survive alone on the prairie. "Some speak against you," Iron Wolf continued, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "Red Crow especially. His son died at Ash Hollow, killed by soldiers. He sees your face and remembers his loss." "I understand," Daniel said quietly, though understanding and accepting were different things entirely. "Do you—" Iron Wolf turned to study him. "Red Crow is not evil. He is wounded. His pain speaks louder than his wisdom sometimes, but he has earned the right to his voice. If you stay, you must live beside him, must earn his tolerance, if not his respect." "How do I do that?" "By being more than what he expects. By proving every day that you are not the soldiers who killed his son." Iron Wolf paused. "And by accepting that for some you will always be the enemy no matter what you do." The weight of those words settled on Daniel's shoulders like a yoke. He'd naively thought that choosing Ayanna, choosing to become Lakota, would be the hard part. Now he realized that had only been the beginning. As the day wore on, the camp buzzed with preparation for the council meeting. Women prepared food, men gathered firewood for the great central fire, and children were warned to stay quiet during the deliberations. Daniel watched it all from his limited vantage point outside Iron Wolf's teepee, trying to read the faces of people who passed searching for signs of support or hostility. Some nodded to him with what might have been respect. Others looked through him as if he didn't exist. A few glared openly, their hostility as sharp as any blade. Among these was a warrior named Spotted Eagle, who had made his feelings clear from the beginning. He was perhaps 30 years old, powerfully built with scars that told of many battles. More importantly, Dakota had quietly informed Danielle. Spotted Eagle had been courting Ayanna before Daniel's arrival. "He offered 20 horses for her," Dakota had explained. "A generous bride price, but Ayanna refused him 3 times. He took it badly." Now Spotted Eagle stood with a group of younger warriors speaking loudly enough for Daniel to hear, even from 50 feet away. Though he spoke in Lakota, Daniel had learned enough to understand the gist. The white man was weak, corrupted by soft living at the fort, would never survive. The winter would bring the army down on them eventually. "Ignore him," Ayanna said, appearing beside Daniel with a bowl of hot stew. "Spotted Eagle speaks from wounded pride, not wisdom." "He's not entirely wrong," Daniel admitted, accepting the bowl gratefully. The stew was rich with buffalo meat and wild roots, far better than anything he'd eaten at the fort. "I am weak. I don't know if I can survive the winter, and my presence could bring danger." Ayanna's expression hardened in a way he'd rarely seen. "You took 30 lashes rather than shame me. That is not weakness. You chose to leave everything you knew for a chance at a different life. That is not soft living. She paused, then added more gently, As for surviving winter, you have me. I will teach you. And if the council says no, she was quiet for a moment, then said with absolute certainty, Then I go with you. Ayanna, you can't. I can. I choose, just as you chose. She touched his face gently, her fingers warm against his cold cheek. My father leads this band, but he does not own me. If they reject you, they reject my choice, and I will not stay where my choices are not honored. Before Daniel could respond, the sound of drums began a deep rhythmic beating that seemed to come from the earth itself. The council was gathering. The council lodge was the largest in the camp, able to hold 30 people comfortably. Tonight it held the 12 members of the Elder Council. Iron Wolf, several senior warriors, including Red Crow and Spotted Eagle, the grandmother in her role as senior medicine woman, and Daniel himself. Ayanna, as an unmarried woman, could not attend, though Daniel suspected she would be listening from just outside. The elders sat in a semicircle facing the fire, their faces painted with ceremonial designs that made them look otherworldly in the flickering light. Iron Wolf sat to one side, present but not presiding. This was the council's authority, not his alone. The eldest of the council, a man whose face was so weathered it looked like bark, spoke first. His name was White Owl, and Dakota had told Daniel he was over 80. Winters Old had lived through the first treaties with the whites, had seen the buffalo herds when they truly darkened the plains. We gather to speak of the white man who would be Lakota. White Owl said, his voice surprisingly strong. Who speaks for him? I do, Iron Wolf said, standing. This man protected my daughter from dishonor. He paid in blood and chose exile rather than reveal her shame. He has begun learning our ways, our words. I believe he should be accepted. And who speaks against Red Crow stood immediately. I do. His voice was thick with barely controlled emotion. This is madness. We take the enemy into our hearts, teach him our ways, show him our weaknesses. My son's blood cries out against this. Your son died with honor in battle, Iron Wolf said carefully. This man has never raised a weapon against the Lakota. All white soldiers are the same, Red Crow spat. They come with smiles and treaties, then break their word when it suits them. How do we know he is not a spy? How do we know the army didn't send him here to learn our secrets? It was a fair question, Daniel realized, and one that had probably occurred to everyone present. From their perspective, his story could easily be an elaborate deception. White Owl raised a hand for silence. The white man may speak for himself. Daniel stood slowly, his back protesting the movement. He'd prepared words in Lakota, had practiced them with Dakota, but standing here in the firelight with all eyes upon him, the words fled. So he spoke from his heart in English, trusting Dakota to translate. I cannot prove I'm not a spy, he began. I can only tell you that the army thinks I'm either dead or a deserter. They would hang me if they found me. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I didn't choose to come here. I chose to protect Ayanna. Coming here, becoming Lakota, that was chosen for me. But now that I'm here, now that I've seen your way of life, I choose to stay. Pretty words, Spotted Eagle interjected. But words mean nothing. He is weak. He cannot hunt, cannot fight, cannot provide for a wife. He would be a burden on the band. That is a valid concern, White Owl said. How do you answer? Daniel felt heat rise in his face. I'm weak now, yes, but I'm healing. I was strong enough to take 30 lashes and live. I'll be strong enough to learn what I need to know. Strength of body is not enough, another elder said, a woman whose name Daniel didn't know. Do you have the strength to kill your own kind if they attack us? Could you fire on soldiers you might have served beside? The lodge went silent. This was the crucial question Daniel realized, the one that cut to the heart of everything. Could he truly turn against his own people if necessary? He thought of Briggs of the soldiers who'd stood by while an innocent girl was threatened. He thought of the systematic destruction of native lands he'd witnessed, the broken treaties, the massacres he'd heard whispered about in the barracks. Then he thought of Ayanna's kindness, Iron Wolf's dignity, the grandmother's healing hands, Dakota's patient teaching. Patient. If soldiers came to hurt this band, Daniel said slowly, they would no longer be my people. My people are those who act with honor. I've seen more honor in 6 weeks here than in 8 months at Fort Laramie. Yes, I could defend the band against anyone who threatened it. Red Crow made a dismissive sound. Easy to say when no guns are pointed at you. Red Crow speaks truth, White Owl said. Words are easy. Actions are hard. How can we know this white man's heart? Test him, Spotted Eagle said immediately. Let him prove his worth. If he claims to be strong enough to be a warrior, let him undertake the trials. Murmurs ran through the lodge. The trials were traditionally undertaken by young Lakota men coming of age, tests of endurance, skill, and courage that marked the transition from boy to warrior. They were grueling, even for those who'd prepared their whole lives. He is not healed enough, the grandmother spoke for the first time. The trials would kill him in his current state. Then let him take them when he is healed, Spotted Eagle pressed. If he succeeds, I will accept him. If he fails or refuses, he must leave. Iron Wolf's expression was troubled. The trials are sacred. They are not meant for whites, Red Crow interrupted. If he would be Lakota, let him prove it the way our sons do. Or is he too special for our traditions? It was another trap, Daniel realized. Refuse and be seen as cowardly or dismissive of their customs. Accept and face tests he was completely unprepared for. I'll do it, Daniel said before he could think better of it. When I'm healed, I'll take the trials. White Owl studied him for a long moment. You understand what you agree to. The trials are not games. Men have died attempting them. I understand. Then it is decided, White Owl announced. The white man called Wikasateka will remain with the band through winter. Come spring, when his body is healed, he will undertake the trials. If he succeeds, he may marry Ayana and be accepted as Lakota. If he fails, he must leave and never return. And if he dies in the attempt, Red Crow asked. Then the spirits will have given their answer, White Owl replied simply. The council dispersed and Daniel found himself standing alone by the dying fire, the magnitude of what he'd agreed to settling over him like a burial shroud. Lakota appeared at his elbow, his usually cheerful expression somber. You don't know what you've agreed to, the young man said quietly. The trials. They break strong men who've trained since childhood. Then you'd better be a good teacher, Daniel replied, trying for lightness he didn't feel. The best teacher cannot make winter into spring, Lakota said. You have perhaps 4 moons to prepare. I have had 18 winters. Ayana was waiting outside, and one look at her face told Daniel she'd heard everything. Without a word, she took his arm and led him away from the lodge out toward the edge of camp, where the vast prairie stretched endlessly under the star-filled sky. You didn't have to agree, she said finally. We could have found another band, made our own way. And have you lose your family, your entire world? No. Daniel shook his head. If taking the trials means you can keep your place here, then I'll take them. You could die. I could have died at the whipping post. At least this death would have meaning. She turned to face him fully, and in the moonlight he could see tears on her cheeks, the first tears he'd seen from her since all this began. I did not save you from the whip to lose you to pride. It's not pride, Daniel said, reaching up to wipe away her tears. It's hope. Hope that I can earn my place here. Hope that we can have a future that isn't built on running or hiding. The trials are 3 parts, Ayana said, her voice taking on the tone of recitation. Endurance, you must run from sunrise to sunset without stopping, following the sacred path through the hills. Vision, you must go alone to the sacred mountain, fast for 4 days and nights, until the spirits send you a vision. Courage, you must face your greatest fear and overcome it, though what that means is different for each man. And if I succeed, then you receive your true name, your place in the band, and the right to marry. She paused. Of all who attempt the trials, perhaps half succeed on their first attempt. Some never succeed at all. But some do succeed, Daniel pointed out, even on their first attempt. They are Lakota. They know the land, the spirits, the ways of survival. She trailed off. I'm a white soldier who can barely speak the language and doesn't know a vision quest from a Sunday sermon, Daniel finished for her. I know, but I have something they didn't have. What? You, he said simply. And the knowledge that failing means losing you, That's worth more than any training. She kissed him, then sudden and fierce their first kiss since this strange courtship began. It was nothing like the chaste pecks he'd exchanged with girls back in Ohio. This was fire and promise and desperation all at once, her hands tangling in his hair, his arms pulling her against him despite the protest from his still healing back. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ayana's expression was determined. Then we begin tomorrow. If you have 4 moons to become a warrior, we cannot waste a single day. What followed was the most intense education of Daniel's life. Each morning before dawn, Dakota would wake him for language lessons, drilling him relentlessly in Lakota, until his head swam with new words and unfamiliar grammar. After breakfast, Ayana would take over teaching him the practical skills of survival, how to read the signs of weather in cloud formations and wind patterns, which plants could be eaten and which would kill you, how to find water in seemingly dry land. The afternoons belonged to the grandmother who taught him the spiritual aspects of Lakota life. This was perhaps the hardest for Daniel to grasp, coming from a world where religion meant Sunday services and memorized prayers. The Lakota saw the sacred in everything, every animal, every rock, every breath of wind had spiritual significance. "You think like a white man still," the grandmother would say when he struggled with concepts. "You see the world as things to be used. We see the world as relations to be honored." "I don't understand it," Daniel admitted after a particularly frustrating lesson about the significance of the 4 directions. "A white man sees a deer and thinks food, or hide, or trophy. Trophy," she explained patiently. "A Lakota sees a deer and thinks brother and gift and sacrifice. The deer gives its life so we might live. We honor that gift with prayer, with ceremony, with using every part and wasting nothing. This is the difference." Slowly, painfully, Daniel began to understand. It wasn't just about learning new information, it was about fundamentally changing how he saw the world. The individualism that had been drilled into him as an American, the idea of man having dominion over nature, the concept of land as property, to be owned, all of this had to be unlearned and replaced with the Lakota worldview of interconnection and reciprocity. The physical training was almost a relief after the mental and spiritual challenges. Once his back had healed enough, Spotted Eagle surprisingly volunteered to teach him combat skills. Daniel suspected this was less about helping and more about having legitimate reasons to beat him senseless, but he gritted his teeth and endured. "You fight like a soldier," Spotted Eagle said, after throwing Daniel to the ground for the 10th time that day. "All straight lines and brute force. A warrior flows like water, strikes like lightning." "Easy for you to say?" Daniel gasped, spitting out a mouthful of dirt. "You've been doing this since childhood." "Excuses are for the dead," Spotted Eagle replied, offering him a hand up. Again, they fought with hands, with knives, with war clubs. Daniel's body became a map of bruises, but gradually he began to see the patterns in Spotted Eagle's movements, began to anticipate and counter. He was never going to be as good as someone who'd trained since childhood, but he could become competent enough to survive. The running was perhaps the worst part. Every morning, regardless of weather, he had to run. At first, he could barely manage a mile without collapsing, his lungs burning in the thin winter air. But Dakota ran with him, pacing him, teaching him how to breathe, how to find the rhythm that could carry him forward when his body screamed to stop. "The trials require you to run from sunrise to sunset," Dakota reminded him when Daniel wanted to quit after 2 hours. "That is perhaps 14 hours in summer. You must build the strength now in winter when the days are short." By the 2nd moon of winter, Daniel could run for 4 hours without stopping. By the 3rd moon, he could manage 6. His body had transformed the soft edges of garrison life, replaced by lean muscle, his pale skin weathered by wind and sun, to something closer to leather. But it was the vision quest preparation that truly frightened him. The grandmother would tell him stories of men who went to the sacred mountain and never returned, their minds lost in visions they couldn't escape. Others came back changed in fundamental ways, having seen truths about themselves they couldn't accept. "The spirits do not lie," she warned. "They show you who you truly are, not who you pretend to be. Many men cannot bear that truth." "What if I don't have a vision?" Daniel asked. "What if the spirits don't speak to me because I'm white?" The grandmother studied him for a long moment. The spirits care nothing for the color of skin. They care about the color of your heart. If your heart is true, they will speak, whether you can understand them. She shrugged. That is a different question. As winter deepened, Daniel's integration into the band continued in small ways. He joined hunting parties, though he was still more liability than asset. He helped with camp duties, gathering firewood, repairing teepees, tending horses. Some members of the band began to accept him, particularly the younger ones who were curious about the outside world. But Red Crow remained hostile, and his influence was significant. He never missed an opportunity to remind others that Daniel was an outsider, a potential threat, a weakness in their defenses. The tension came to a head during a particularly severe blizzard. The band had been caught in the open while moving to better shelter, and several families were struggling with damaged teepees and scattered supplies. Daniel was helping a young mother secure her lodge when he heard screaming. A child had wandered off in the storm. Red Crow's grandson, a boy of perhaps 6 winters. The child's parents were frantic, and search parties were quickly organized, but the visibility was almost zero. The wind howling so loudly that voices couldn't carry more than a few feet. Daniel joined the search without hesitation, despite Red Crow's snarl that they didn't need help from a white man. He remembered something his grandmother back in Ohio had told him about finding lost things. Don't think like an adult, think like what you're looking for. A 6-year-old boy, frightened, cold, disoriented. He wouldn't go far, but he'd seek shelter. Daniel began checking every small depression, every cluster of rocks that might offer protection from the wind. The cold was brutal, his fingers and toes going numb despite the fur-lined gloves and moccasins Ayanna had made for him. Then he heard it, or thought he did. A thin sound that might have been crying or might have been the wind. He followed it, stumbling through drifts that came up to his waist until he literally fell into a small ravine. The boy was there, huddled against the bank, his lips blue with cold. Daniel didn't hesitate. He stripped off his own coat and wrapped it around the child, then picked him up and began the struggle back toward camp. The boy was unconscious by the time Daniel staggered back into the circle of teepees, his own body shaking violently from cold and exhaustion. Red Crow was there, immediately snatching his grandson from Daniel's arms. For a moment their eyes met the grieving father who'd lost 3 sons to white soldiers, and the white soldier who'd just saved his grandson. Red Crow said nothing, but something shifted in his expression, some fraction of the hostility easing. The boy survived, though it was close. Daniel himself spent 3 days recovering from exposure, tended by Ayanna and the grandmother who muttered about foolish heroes the entire time. But when he finally emerged from the teepee, he noticed the difference immediately. People nodded to him with what looked like actual respect. Children who'd been warned away from him now approached openly. Even some of Red Crow's supporters seemed less hostile. "You did a good thing," Iron Wolf told him. "Red Crow will not forget. He may never call you brother, but he will no longer call for your blood." As winter began to ease its grip and the first hints of spring appeared, tiny green shoots pushing through melting snow, Daniel's training intensified. He could now run for 8 hours, though the last 2 were agony. His Lakota had improved to the point where he could hold complex conversations, understand the stories told around the evening fires. He could track deer, set snares, identify edible plants, and fight well enough that Spotted Eagle only threw him to the ground every 3rd exchange instead of every time. But the trials were only weeks away, and Daniel knew he wasn't ready. How could anyone be ready for something like this? One evening, as he sat with Ayanna watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, she asked him a question that had apparently been weighing on her mind. "If you fail, will you really leave?" Daniel considered lying, telling her what she wanted to hear. But their relationship had been built on truth from the beginning. The brutal truth of violence prevented punishment, endured cultures bridged. "If I fail, I'll have to," he said finally. "Not because I want to, but because staying would undermine your father's authority, create division in the band. I couldn't do that to him or to you." "Then you cannot fail," she said simply. "Ayanna, I need you to promise me something," Daniel said, taking her hands. "If I don't survive the trials, don't say that. I need to say it. If I don't survive, or if I fail, promise me you'll move on. Find someone who can give you the life you deserve. Don't waste your life mourning what could have been." She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I cannot promise that, just as you could not promise to stand by while those soldiers threatened me. Some choices are made by the heart, not the mind." 2 weeks before the spring equinox, when the trials would begin, a rider arrived at the camp with news that changed everything. Fort Laramie had sent out patrols looking for a deserter, a private named Daniel Harper, who had information vital to military operations. There was a bounty on his head, and they were questioning all the peaceful bands about his whereabouts. "They know you're alive," Iron Wolf said grimly. "Someone must have seen you leave with us." "I should go," Daniel said immediately. "If I leave now, they won't connect me to the band." "And go where?" Iron Wolf asked. "You cannot survive alone, and any other band will know there is a bounty. No, you stay, but this changes things." "How?" "If you pass the trials, you truly become Lakota. The man called Daniel Harper ceases to exist. Even if the soldiers find you, they would find only Wakasateka, a warrior of our band. It would be harder for them to prove you are who they seek. And if I fail, then you run and we can truthfully say we cast you out." Iron Wolf's expression was troubled. "I do not like using the sacred trials for deception, but I see no other way." The pressure was immense. Now it wasn't just about earning his place or winning the right to marry Ayanna. It was about survival itself. Daniel threw himself into preparation with renewed desperation, running until he collapsed, practicing combat until his hands bled, studying spiritual texts until the symbols swam before his eyes. 3 days before the trials, the grandmother called him to her teepee. She had prepared something to drink that smelled of sage and something bitter. "This will help prepare your mind for the vision quest," she said. "It will not give you visions, but it will teach your spirit how to be open to them." Daniel drank it without hesitation, though it tasted like dirt mixed with rotting leaves. Within minutes, the world began to shift. Colors became more vivid, sounds took on texture, and the boundary between himself and the world around him seemed to dissolve. He spent the next hours, or perhaps days, he couldn't tell, in a state of expanded consciousness. The grandmother guided him through it, teaching him how to navigate the space between waking and sleeping, between the physical and spiritual worlds. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. When he finally returned to normal consciousness, he felt different. Not changed exactly, but aware of dimensions of experience he'd never known existed. The grandmother studied his face and nodded approval. "You have the capacity," she said. "Whether you have the strength to endure what the spirits show you, only the mountain will tell." The night before the trials, the entire band gathered for a ceremony. Daniel sat in the place of honor, dressed in the ceremonial clothes Ayanna had made for him, soft doeskin, decorated with beadwork that told the story of his joining the band. He looked, Dakota had assured him, almost like a real Lakota warrior. Red Crow stood during the ceremony, surprising everyone. "I have not been friend to this white man," he said, his voice carrying across the gathering. "My heart has been hard toward him, but he saved my grandson from the winter death, risking his own life. For this I give him my blessing for the trials. If he succeeds, I will call him warrior, though perhaps not brother." It was more than Daniel had hoped for, and he bowed his head in acknowledgement of the enormous concession Red Crow had made. Spotted Eagle also stood. "This man has learned to fight like a warrior. He is not the soft soldier who came to us. If he succeeds in the trials, I will accept him as husband to Ayanna." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "Though I still think she could do better." Laughter rippled through the gathering, easing the tension. Finally, Iron Wolf stood. "Tomorrow, Wakasateka begins the trials that will determine his place among us. He attempts something no white man has done to become truly Lakota, not just in name, but in spirit. Whatever happens, he has already shown more courage than most men possess. I am proud to call him son-to-be." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He stood outside the teepee, looking at the stars, trying to calm his racing mind. Tomorrow would begin 3 days that would determine the rest of his life, whether he had a life at all. Ayanna found him there, wrapped in a buffalo robe against the chill. She didn't speak, just stood beside him, her presence a comfort beyond words. Finally, as the eastern sky began to lighten, with the first hint of dawn, she turned to him. "Remember," she said softly, "you are not the man who came to us broken and bleeding. You are not the soldier who struck his superior. You are Wikasa Teka new man. You are who you choose to be. As the sun broke the horizon, painting the world in shades of gold and pink, Daniel knew she was right. Win or lose, live or die. He was no longer Private Daniel Harper of Fort Laramie. That man had died at the whipping post. What remained to be seen was whether Wikasa Teka would prove strong enough to be born. The drums began before the sun fully cleared the horizon, their rhythm matching the thunderous beating of Daniel's heart as he stood at the starting point of the sacred running path. The entire band had gathered to witness the beginning of the trials, their faces solemn in the early morning light. The path stretched out before him, winding through the hills and valleys marked by ancient stone cairns that generations of young Lakota men had passed on their journey to becoming warriors. White Owl raised his staff, and the drums stopped. In the sudden silence, Daniel could hear his own breathing harsh and quick. He wore only a breechcloth and moccasins, his scarred back exposed to the cool morning air. The grandmother had painted sacred symbols on his chest and face with red ochre and white clay markings that would identify him to the spirits as a seeker of visions, a man between worlds. From sunrise to sunset you must run, White Owl intoned. You may not stop, may not walk, may not rest. If you fall, you may rise and continue. If you stop, the trial ends, and you fail. Do you understand? I understand, Daniel replied in Lakota, his accent still noticeable but the words clear. Then begin. Daniel started running his pace measured and steady. Dakota had taught him well. The mistake most men made was starting too fast, burning through their energy in the first hours. The key was finding a rhythm that could be maintained a pace that became meditation rather than effort. The first hour was almost pleasant. The morning was cool, his body fresh, his breathing easy. He passed the first cairn, then the second, winding higher into the hills. Below he could see the camp growing smaller, the people who'd gathered to watch now just dots against the prairie. By the third hour, the sun had risen high enough to bring real warmth, and sweat began to stream down his body. His breathing was harder now, but still controlled. He focused on his form, on the placement of each foot, on maintaining the rhythm Dakota had drilled into him through those long winter months. The fourth hour brought the first real challenge. The path led up a steep incline, switching back and forth across the face of a rocky hill. His calves burned, his thighs shook, but he kept running, even if the pace had slowed to barely more than a shuffle. At the top, he allowed himself a moment to look back. He could no longer see the camp at all. He was alone with the path and the sky and the increasing fire in his muscles. By noon, 6 hours in, Daniel had entered a state beyond simple exhaustion. His body moved without conscious thought, each step automatic, mechanical. The sacred symbols on his chest had smeared with sweat, creating abstract patterns that seemed to shift and move in his peripheral vision. His mouth was dry as dust, despite the small sips of water he'd taken from the streams he'd passed. Drinking was allowed, but only while still running, scooping water with one hand while maintaining motion. The seventh hour nearly broke him. The path descended sharply into a valley, and the pounding impact on his knees sent shooting pains up his legs. Every instinct screamed at him to slow to a walk just for a moment, just to ease the agony, but he could hear Dakota's voice in his memory. When your body wants to stop, that is when your spirit must take over. The trial is not of the flesh, but of the will. So he ran on, tears streaming down his face from the pain mixing with the sweat and the remnants of the sacred paint. He began to hallucinate slightly, seeing figures running beside him, warriors from generations past who had run this same path. Or perhaps they were real spirits come to witness his struggle. In his exhausted state, it didn't matter. The eighth hour brought a strange second wind. The pain hadn't decreased, if anything it had gotten worse, but it had become something separate from him, something he could observe without being consumed by it. His breathing had found a rhythm that matched his footfalls, and for stretches of minutes at a time, he felt as if he were floating above his body, watching it run without being truly present in it. The path wound through a grove of cottonwoods, their new spring leaves providing blessed shade. Here beside another stream, Daniel saw something that made him stumble, a figure standing beside the path. For a moment he thought it was Ayanna come to encourage him, but as he drew closer he realized it was a young Lakota woman he didn't recognize, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, her face painted in a style he'd never seen among Iron Wolf's band. She spoke to him in Lakota, but her dialect was archaic, hard to understand. "You run with two hearts," she seemed to say. "Which one will you feed?" Before he could respond, not that he had breath to spare for speech, she was gone, vanished between one blink and the next. Daniel ran on, wondering if he'd imagined her or if the exhaustion had opened his mind to visions already. The 10th hour was agony incarnate. His legs had gone past pain into a kind of numb fire. Every step sent shockwaves through his body. He'd developed a stitch in his side that felt like a heated blade, and his breathing had become ragged gasps. The sun was afternoon hot now, beating down mercilessly. The path led along a ridge where the drop on one side was severe enough that a stumble would mean death. Daniel focused on the narrow track, on placing each foot precisely, using the concentration required as a distraction from his body's screaming demand to stop. It was here that the second vision came. A man in a blue cavalry uniform stood on the path ahead, but as Daniel approached, he saw it was himself, or rather, who he used to be. Private Harper, clean-shaven, standing at attention, everything he'd left behind. "You're killing yourself for savages, Chuck," the vision said in English. "You had a life, a purpose, a place in the world. Now what are you? Neither white nor Indian, neither soldier nor warrior. You're nothing." Daniel ran through the apparition, which dissolved like mist, but the words lingered, adding mental anguish to the physical torment. The 12th hour brought him to the highest point of the path, a mesa that offered a view of the entire world, it seemed. He could see the camp far below, could see tiny figures gathered, watching. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting everything gold. His legs gave out here, and he fell hard, skinning his knees and palms on the rocky ground. For a moment he lay there, gasping, every fiber of his being demanding he stay down. This was allowed, he could fall. He just couldn't stop running. Somehow, impossibly, he pushed himself back up. His legs shook so violently he could barely stand, but he forced them to move one step, then another, building back to the shuffling run that was all he could manage now. The 13th hour was a blank. Later, he would have no memory of it at all, just a vague sense of forward motion and suffering beyond description. The 14th hour, the final hour as the sun touched the mountain peaks, Daniel descended back toward the camp. He could see the people gathered at the finish point, could hear drums again encouraging, pulling him forward. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel, everything at the edges dark and blurry. He tasted blood he'd bitten through his lip at some point. The final mile was flat prairie leading straight to where White Owl stood with his staff raised. Daniel's run had deteriorated to barely more than a stumbling shuffle, but it was still technically running still forward motion without walking. Lakota appeared at his side. When had that happened, running alongside him, but not touching, not helping, just bearing witness? 200 steps, Lakota said quietly. "You can do anything for 200 steps." Daniel counted them, each one an eternity, each one a victory. 150, 100, 50, 20, 10. He collapsed across the finish line as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, his body simply ceasing to function. He was dimly aware of hands lifting him, of Ayana's voice, speaking urgent words he couldn't understand, of being carried somewhere. When he woke, it was night. He was in Iron Wolf's teepee, his legs wrapped in poultices that smelled of mint and something medicinal. Every muscle in his body felt like it had been beaten with clubs. Ayana sat beside him, her hand cool on his forehead. "You did it?" she whispered when she saw his eyes open. 14 hours of running. Even Spotted Eagle was impressed. "One down," Daniel croaked, his voice barely audible. "2 to go." "Rest now," she said. "You have 2 days to recover before the vision quest." 2 days. Daniel wanted to laugh at the impossibility of it. He could barely move, couldn't imagine walking, let alone climbing the sacred mountain. But the trials didn't care about his limitations. They were designed to push men past what they thought possible, to break them down and see what remained. The next day, the grandmother worked on his legs with skilled hands, massaging oils that burned, then numbed into the destroyed muscles. She forced him to walk despite the agony, knowing that if he didn't move, the muscles would seize completely. Many men fail the vision quest, not because they lack spiritual strength, but because their bodies are too damaged from the run to make the climb, she explained. You must move, must keep the blood flowing, or you will not even reach the mountain." That evening, Red Crow visited. It was the first time the man had entered Iron Wolf's teepee since Daniel had arrived. He sat across from Daniel, his face unreadable. "You ran well," he said finally. "Better than some born to it." "Thank you," Daniel managed. "Do not thank me. I state only fact." Red Crow was quiet for a moment, then continued. "The vision quest is different. It is not about strength of body, but strength of spirit. The mountain will show you truth. Not all men can bear their truth." "What did you see?" Daniel asked. Then immediately wondered if he'd overstepped. Such visions were intensely personal. But Red Crow answered, "I saw my own death, saw how my anger would destroy not just me but those I loved. It took me 3 quests to accept that vision to change my path." He looked directly at Daniel. "You will have only one chance. Whatever the mountain shows you, you must accept it, integrate it, or you will be lost." On the morning of the 3rd day, Daniel stood at the base of the sacred mountain. His legs still hurt, but the grandmother's treatments had worked minor miracles. He could walk, could climb, though every step would be painful. The mountain wasn't particularly tall, but it was steep and rocky with no clear path to the summit where the Vision Quest platform waited. He carried nothing, no food, no water, no weapons. For the next 4 days and nights he would fast and pray, waiting for the spirits to speak. The climb took most of the day. By the time he reached the platform, a flat area about 10 feet square marked by ancient paintings on the surrounding rocks, the sun was already descending. Daniel settled himself in the center, crossing his legs despite the protest from his still damaged muscles, and began to pray. He didn't know what to pray for exactly. The grandmother had taught him some traditional prayers, but they felt foreign on his tongue. So he spoke from his heart, addressing whatever spirits might be listening, asking for wisdom, for strength, for understanding of his place in this world he'd chosen. The first night was cold but manageable. Daniel didn't sleep, couldn't sleep between the pain in his legs and the awareness that he was alone on a mountain with nothing between him and the vast universe but his own fragile flesh. He watched the stars wheel overhead, picked out constellations Lakota had taught him, different from the ones he'd learned as a child, but equally beautiful. The first day brought thirst. His mouth became dry, his lips began to crack. The sun beat down mercilessly, and there was no shade on the platform. Daniel continued to pray, though his voice became a whisper, then just moving lips without sound. The second night brought the beginning of visions. At first just movements in his peripheral vision shapes that vanished when he turned to look. Then more solid forms, animals that weren't quite there, people from his past walking across the platform as if it were a street in Ohio. His mother appeared looking as she had when he'd left for the army, worried, proud, sad, all at once. "My son is dead," she said conversationally. "They told me he deserted, but I know he must be dead. My Daniel would never abandon his duty." "I'm sorry," he tried to say, but no sound came out. His father appeared next, his face twisted with the rage Daniel remembered from childhood. "Weak," he spat. "Always weak. Couldn't make the farm work, couldn't be a proper soldier now, playing at being a savage. You're no son of mine." The visions became more intense as the second day progressed. The thirst was agony, now his tongue swollen, his vision blurring. He saw battles between cavalry and Lakota, saw teepees burning, saw children running from soldiers who looked just like he used to look. He saw Ayanna in a white woman's dress, her hair cut short, her eyes empty of everything that made her who she was. "This is the future," a voice said, though he couldn't see the speaker. "Your peoples will never coexist. One must destroy the other. By choosing their side, you've only delayed the inevitable and betrayed your own kind." The third night nearly broke him. The visions became horrific. He saw his own death a dozen different ways, saw Ayanna dying in childbirth with his mixed-blood child, saw Iron Wolf executed as a rebel, saw the entire band massacred while he stood helplessly by, unable to save either his adopted people or prevent his birth people from committing the atrocity. But worse than the visions of death were the visions of life of the future that might await. He saw himself years from now neither fully Lakota nor white, his children rejected by both worlds. He saw the reservations that would come, the forced marches, the deliberate destruction of the culture he was trying so hard to join. He saw himself as an old man forgotten by both peoples, dying alone with no identity at all. "You cannot change what will be," the voice said. And now he could see the speaker, it was himself, or rather, a version of himself. This Daniel was older, wearing a mixture of white and Lakota clothing, his face bearing the exhaustion of a man who'd spent his life fighting an unwinnable battle. The Lakota are doomed. The old ways will die. By joining them, you accomplish nothing except to add your own suffering to theirs. Maybe, Daniel whispered through cracked lips, but at least I'll have stood for something. At least I'll have chosen love over fear. Love? The other Daniel laughed bitterly. Love is just another word for delusion. You think Ayanna loves you? She loves the idea of you, the white man who chose her people. But when the novelty wears off, when the reality of what you've done sets in, what then? Daniel had no answer. The doubt wormed into his heart, fed by exhaustion and dehydration and the mounting pressure of the visions. The fourth day brought a strange peace. He was beyond thirst now, beyond hunger, beyond even the visions. He floated in a space between living and dying, aware that his body was failing but unable to care. The sun moved across the sky, but time had lost meaning. As the fourth night began, his last night on the mountain, Daniel felt himself letting go. Not giving up exactly, but releasing his desperate grip on who he thought he was, who he thought he needed to be. Private Harper was dead. Wikasateca was not yet born. In this moment, he was nothing and everything suspended between worlds. That's when the true vision came. He was standing in a place that wasn't a place, surrounded by a light that wasn't light. Before him stood three figures. The first was a Lakota warrior in traditional dress, his face painted for war, his eyes fierce with pride. The second was a U.S. cavalry officer, his uniform pristine, his bearing rigid with discipline. The third was harder to see, shifting between the two forms, sometimes seeming to be both at once. "Choose," the warrior said. "Choose," the officer echoed. "I already have chosen," Daniel said, surprised to find his voice strong here in this not place. "Have you?" the shifting figure asked, and its voice was all voices and no voice. "Or have you simply run from one to another? Choosing is not fleeing. Choosing is becoming." "I don't understand." The figure solidified slightly, and Daniel saw it more clearly. It was him, but not him. This version wore both cultures with equal comfort, bore both heritages without conflict. It was what he could become if he could accept a truth he'd been fighting. "You seek to be Lakota to escape being white," the figure said. "But you cannot cut away half your soul. You are both, and neither bridge and chasm, healing and wound. This is not weakness, this is your gift. The band will never accept that. They want me to become fully Lakota. The band wants you to choose them over your birth people. This you have done. But becoming Lakota does not mean ceasing to be what you were. Iron Wolf knows this. Why do you think he accepted you? Not despite your white blood, but because of it. He sees the future coming, knows his people need bridges." "Bridges get walked on from both sides," Daniel pointed out. "Yes," the figure agreed. "That is the price, but without bridges, both sides remain forever separate, forever at war. You are not the solution, but you might be part of it." The vision began to fade, but the figure had one more thing to say. "Your greatest fear is not death or pain or loss. Your greatest fear is being nothing, belonging nowhere. Accept this fear. Embrace it. The man who belongs everywhere belongs nowhere, but the man who belongs nowhere is free to create his own place." Daniel woke to find the sun rising on the fifth day. The vision quest was over. He was still alive, though, barely. His body felt like a dried husk, capable of crumbling to dust at the slightest touch. But his mind was clear in a way it had never been before. He understood now what the third trial would be. The descent from the mountain took most of the morning. His legs barely functioned, and several times he had to slide down rocky sections on his back, adding new scratches to his collection of injuries. By the time he reached the base, a small party was waiting: Iron Wolf, White Owl, the grandmother, and surprisingly, Red Crow. They gave him water, just small sips at first, though his body screamed for more. The grandmother examined him with professional efficiency, checking his eyes, his reflexes, the extent of his dehydration. "He needs rest," she declared. "At least a day before the final trial." "No," White Owl said firmly. The trials continue now or they end incomplete. This is the way. Daniel wanted to protest, to beg for just a few hours of sleep, but he knew White Owl was right. The trials were meant to push men past all limits. Asking for rest now would be admitting defeat. "What is the final trial?" he asked, his voice rough as sandpaper. "That depends on you," White Owl replied. "The trial of courage requires you to face your greatest fear. The vision quest should have shown you what that is. Now you must tell us, and we will arrange the test." Daniel thought of the vision of the shifting figure that was both and neither of the bridge that got walked on from both sides. He knew what his fear was, had always known it even if he'd never admitted it. "My greatest fear," he said slowly, "is having to fight my own people, having to choose between protecting the band and not killing soldiers I might have served beside." The elders exchanged glances. This was not what they'd expected. "That is not something we can test safely," Red Crow said. "We cannot actually attack soldiers to see what you would do." "But we can simulate it," Iron Wolf said thoughtfully. "There is a way if you are willing." "What way?" "Some of our young warriors could dress as soldiers. They would attack the camp. You would have to defend against them knowing that in reality they are your Lakota brothers, but responding as if they were truly soldiers. It tests both aspects of your fear, fighting those who appear to be your birth people and potentially harming those who are actually your adopted people." It was elegant in its cruelty. Daniel would have to fight, possibly injure men he'd come to care about, while they appeared as the soldiers he'd once called brothers. "There's more," White Owl added. "To make the test genuine, the warriors will not hold back. They will fight to subdue you, and you must fight to stop them. Real weapons, real danger. Some tests of courage are symbolic. This one will not be. When now we return to camp, you will have 1 hour to prepare yourself, then the attack comes." The ride back to camp was a blur. Daniel could barely stay on the horse, his body shutting down from exhaustion and dehydration. But his mind was racing. How could he fight Lakota warriors dressed as soldiers? How could he not, if passing the trial meant protecting everything he'd come to love? At the camp, Ayanna was waiting. She took one look at him, and tears filled her eyes. He must have looked like death walking. But she said nothing, just helped him to Iron Wolf's teepee where his weapons waited. The weapons were another cruel twist. They'd provided him with both Lakota and American arms, a war club and knife, but also a cavalry saber they'd somehow acquired, and most disturbing of all, a pistol. The same model he'd carried at Fort Laramie. "Choose your weapons," White Owl instructed. "Choose what you will use to defend the camp." Daniel looked at the array. The smart choice would be the pistol-ranged weapons always had an advantage, but taking up the gun felt like a betrayal of everything he'd been trying to become. Yet rejecting it entirely felt like denying part of himself. In the end, he took the knife and the pistol, one in each hand. Bridge and chasm, both and neither. 1 hour, White Owl reminded him. "Prepare yourself." The hour passed in a heartbeat. Daniel tried to eat something, managed a few bites of pemmican that his stomach immediately wanted to reject. He drank more water, feeling it soak into his desiccated tissues. Ayanna helped him into a shirt. His back still couldn't tolerate much contact, and painted his face with the same red ochre she'd used for the running trial. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "you have already proven yourself to me." "But not to them," Daniel replied, nodding toward the gathered band members who were forming a circle, creating the battlefield for this final test. A war cry shattered the afternoon quiet. From the east, 5 figures came riding hard toward the camp. Daniel's breath caught. They'd done too good a job. The warriors wore cavalry uniforms that must have been taken from dead soldiers, their faces hidden beneath the broad-brimmed hats. They carried sabers and pistols, and their approach was a perfect simulation of a cavalry charge. For a moment, Daniel froze. His mind flashed back to Fort Laramie, to drilling with these same men. No, not these men, but men just like them. Men who'd shared his meals, his duties, his purpose. The lead rider raised his pistol, and Daniel saw it was Spotted Eagle, his face grim beneath the cavalry hat. The gun fired blank, surely, but Daniel didn't have time to wonder. He moved on instinct, rolling to the side as Spotted Eagle's horse thundered past. Another rider was coming straight at him, saber raised. Daniel recognized the stance, the grip, the angle of attack, all textbook cavalry training. He brought up his own pistol, aimed, and hesitated. This wasn't a real soldier. This was a Lakota warrior, someone from the band he'd sworn to protect. The hesitation nearly cost him everything. The saber came down and only a desperate parry with his knife saved him from being split open. The blade was real, the force behind it, genuine. White Owl hadn't lied, the warriors weren't holding back. Daniel's training took over not his Lakota training, but his army training. He grabbed the rider's wrist, used the man's momentum to pull him from the horse. They went down together, rolling in the dust. The warrior's hat came off, and Daniel saw it was one of Dakota's friends, a young man named Crowfeather, who'd been friendly to him. Crowfeather's eyes were cold, committed to the role. He brought his knee up into Daniel's stomach, driving what little air he had from his lungs. Daniel gasped, saw the saber coming again, and made a choice. He shot Crowfeather in the shoulder. The crack of the pistol was different from the blanks. This was real, though Daniel had aimed to wound, not kill. Crowfeather went down, blood spreading across the blue cavalry jacket. The young warrior's eyes showed shock, then something like respect. "Behind you!" someone screamed Ayana's voice. Daniel spun to find another rider bearing down on him. No time to think, no time to hesitate. He raised the pistol, fired twice. Both shots went wide, but they spooked the horse, sending it veering away. The 5 warriors had dismounted now, forming a semicircle around him. In their cavalry uniforms, they looked exactly like a squad preparing to arrest or execute a deserter. One of them even had sergeant's stripes, a detail that made Daniel's heart clench. "Surrender, traitor," Spotted Eagle called out in English. "Come back with us to face justice." It was theater, but it felt real. Too real. Daniel's vision blurred, whether from exhaustion or emotion he couldn't tell. "I'm not going back," he heard himself say. "This is my home now." "Then you'll die here," Spotted Eagle replied, and they charged. What followed was the most brutal fight of Daniel's life. The warriors came at him with the coordinated precision of trained soldiers using tactics Daniel recognized from his own training. But they also fought with the fluid grace of Lakota warriors, switching between styles in a way that kept him off balance. Daniel fought back with everything he had, using both the knife and the pistol as a club when the bullets ran out. He took a saber cut across his ribs, a punch that likely broke his nose, countless bruises from fists and feet. But he gave as good as he got, putting 2 more warriors down with injuries that would keep them from continuing the fight. It came down to him and Spotted Eagle, both bloody, both exhausted beyond measure. The older warrior had lost his hat, revealing the Lakota braids beneath, but the uniform still made him look like a cavalry officer. "You fight well for a white man," Spotted Eagle said, circling him warily. "I'm not just a white man anymore," Daniel replied, matching his movements. "No, then what are you?" The question hung in the air between them, the same question the vision had posed, the same question Daniel had been struggling with since the day he'd chosen to leave Fort Laramie. "I'm both," Daniel said, and in saying it felt something shift inside him. "I'm white and Lakota soldier and warrior bridge and chasm. I'm something new." Spotted Eagle smiled, then the first genuine smile Daniel had ever seen from him. "Good answer." He attacked anyway because the trial wasn't over. They grappled, fell, rolled in the dust. Daniel's destroyed body screamed for relief, but he fought on, driven by something beyond physical strength. This was his greatest fear made manifest, having to fight those who looked like his people to protect those who had become his people. In the end, Daniel managed to get his knife to Spotted Eagle's throat. They froze their Daniel on top, the blade pressed against skin but not breaking it. "Do it," Spotted Eagle whispered. "Complete the trial. Show them you can kill your own kind if needed." Daniel looked into the warrior's eyes, saw the test within the test. They wanted to know if he could kill, yes, but also if he knew when not to kill. "No," Daniel said, pulling the knife away and struggling to his feet. "The threat is subdued. Killing now would be murder, not protection." He stood there swaying, blood running from multiple wounds, the knife still in his hand. Around him, the warriors he'd injured were being tended to. The one he'd shot, Crowfeather, gave him a thumbs up from where the grandmother was working on his shoulder. White Owl stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "The trial is complete," he announced. "Wikasa Teka has faced his greatest fear, being forced to choose between his 2 peoples. He chose to protect, to wound, but not kill, to show mercy when the threat was ended. This is the way of a true warrior." The crowd erupted in celebration, but Daniel didn't hear it. The last of his strength gave out, and he collapsed, the knife falling from nerveless fingers. He was unconscious before he hit the ground. He woke 3 days later, his body a symphony of pain, but his spirit strangely light. Ayanna was there as she always seemed to be when he woke from injury or trial. "It's over," she said softly, tears on her cheeks. "You did it. All 3 trials passed. The warriors I hurt. All healing. Crowfeather is particularly proud of his scar. He says being shot by the man who might bridge our peoples is an honor." "Might bridge," Daniel repeated. "Not will bridge." "No one can promise the future," Ayanna said. "But you've proven you'll try. That's all anyone can ask." Iron Wolf entered the teepee, followed by White Owl and, surprisingly, Red Crow. The 3 men studied Daniel for a long moment. "The council has met," White Owl announced formally. "You have passed the trials. You are no longer Wikasateca Newman. That was a temporary name, a becoming name." Daniel's heart sank. "Were they rejecting him after all? Your true name," Iron Wolf continued, "given by the spirits and confirmed by your actions, is Walks Between Worlds. For that is what you are, a man of 2 peoples, belonging fully to neither, but serving as a bridge for both." Walks Between Worlds. Daniel No, that name belonged to the past, now felt the rightness of it settle into his bones. "And," Red Crow added, "stepping forward, you have earned the right to marry Ayanna." He paused, then added something that clearly cost him great effort. "I was wrong about you. My grandson lives because of you. You fought with honor in the trials. I name you warrior and—" He paused again. "Brother." From Red Crow, who had lost 3 sons to white soldiers, it was an enormous gift. Walks Between Worlds bowed his head in acknowledgement. "When you are healed," Iron Wolf said, "we will hold the marriage ceremony, but know that in the eyes of the band you are already accepted, already one of us." They left him alone with Ayanna then, and she curled against his less injured side, careful not to press against his wounds. "Walks Between Worlds," she said, testing the name. "It suits you." "It's a heavy name, Suam," he replied. "A lot to live up to." "You've been living up to it since the day you threw that punch," she pointed out. "The name just makes it official." They lay in comfortable silence for a while, then Ayanna spoke again. "There's something you should know. While you were unconscious, a rider came from Fort Laramie." Daniel tensed. "Soldiers. A messenger only. The new commander, Colonel Winters, was replaced, is less interested in hunting deserters than in maintaining peace. The message was that Private Daniel Harper is officially listed as dead killed by hostiles while defending settlers. Your name has been cleared of desertion charges." "But I did desert." "You died," Ayanna corrected. "Daniel Harper died at that whipping post, choosing honor over comfort. Walks Between Worlds was born from that death. The Army, without knowing it, has acknowledged this truth." It was fitting, in a way. The man he'd been was truly dead as surely as if Lakota arrows had found him. But instead of actual death, he'd been reborn into something new, something that perhaps could help prevent the deaths of others. A week later, when Walks Between Worlds could stand without swaying, could walk without limping too badly. The marriage ceremony was held. It was unlike any wedding he might have imagined back in Ohio. No church, no priest, no white dress. Instead, there was the open sky, the sacred pipe, and the entire band as witnesses. Ayanna wore a dress she'd made herself white doeskin covered in beadwork that told their story, the confrontation at the fort, the whipping post, the trials, and now their joining. Her hair was woven with eagle feathers and strips of red cloth, and she'd never looked more beautiful. Walks Between Worlds wore traditional Lakota wedding attire that Iron Wolf had commissioned, shirt and leggings decorated with symbols of both his birth culture and his adopted one. The grandmother had insisted on adding a special touch, small blue beads along the shoulders, the same blue as the cavalry uniform he'd once worn. "To remember where you came from," she'd explained. "Not with shame, but with acknowledgement. You are both always." The ceremony itself was simple but profound. They exchanged vows not just to each other, but to the band, promising to support the community, to raise their children in the traditional ways, to be bridge builders and peacemakers. When Iron Wolf wrapped them both in a single blanket symbolizing their unity, the band erupted in celebration. Even Red Crow smiled, and Spotted Eagle clapped Walks Between Worlds on the shoulder hard enough to make him wince. "You fought well in the trials," Spotted Eagle said. "I thought you would fail. I was wrong."
You fought well, too," Walks Between Worlds replied. That cavalry charge was too convincing. Spotted Eagle laughed. "I studied the soldiers for years, learned their ways to fight them better. Never thought that knowledge would help welcome one of them as a brother." The feast that followed went late into the night. There was dancing, storytelling, and more food than the band usually saw outside of a successful buffalo hunt. At one point, Dakota pulled Walks Between Worlds aside. "You know this is just the beginning," the young man said. "Being accepted is one thing. Living as one of us, raising children who are both white and Lakota, dealing with both worlds as they move toward war, that's the real trial." "I know," Walks Between Worlds replied. "But at least I won't face it alone." He looked across the fire at Ayanna, who was dancing with the other women, her laughter bright as stars.
She caught his gaze and smiled, and in that smile was promise and challenge and love all mixed together. Later in their own teepee, a wedding gift from the band they lay together as husband and wife. The physical joining was gentle, careful of his still healing wounds, but profound in its significance. This was the final bridge crossed the last transformation from Daniel Harper to Walks Between Worlds. "No regrets?" Ayanna asked, afterward, tracing the scars on his back with gentle fingers. "None," he answered honestly. "Everything I lost led me to everything I gained. The soldiers might still come. Your presence here might bring danger to the band. Or it might bring understanding. If soldiers know that one of their own chose to become Lakota, maybe some of them will think twice before attacking. That's a lot of hope to place on one man's choice." "Maybe. But what's the alternative? Except that our peoples will always be at war, that our children will have to choose one side or the other." He pulled her closer. "I'd rather hope." Outside their teepee, the celebration continued, but quieter now, more intimate. Songs were being sung, stories told. The sound of the band at peace at celebration, accepting what many would have said was impossible, a white soldier become Lakota warrior. The morning after the wedding, Walks Between Worlds woke to find frost on the inside of the teepee walls, an early sign that winter was returning to the plains despite the recent spring trials. Ayanna was already awake, tending a small fire that cast dancing shadows across the buffalo hide walls. She moved with the quiet efficiency he'd come to admire, every gesture purposeful, economical. "The scouts report soldiers moving north," she said without preamble when she saw his eyes open. 2 days' ride from here." The peace of their wedding night shattered like ice on a pond. Walks Between Worlds sat up quickly, ignoring the protest from his still healing wounds. "How many?" "Perhaps 30. They carry the flag of peace, but—" She shrugged. "Soldiers' peace and true peace are often different things." He dressed quickly, his mind already racing. This was what he'd feared, what they'd all known was coming eventually. His presence here was no secret, not after the messenger from Fort Laramie. The new commander might have declared Daniel Harper dead, but rumors had a way of surviving official proclamations. Iron Wolf's teepee was already crowded with the band's leaders when they arrived. Red Crow was there, his face grim along with White Owl, Spotted Eagle, and several other senior warriors. They all looked up when Walks Between Worlds entered, and he saw the question in their eyes was this because of him. "The scouts say they're following the treaty road," Iron Wolf said, addressing the unspoken concern. "They haven't deviated toward our camp. It may be nothing to do with us." "Or it may be everything to do with us," Red Crow countered, though without his former hostility toward Walks Between Worlds. "The timing is suspicious. A week after our new brother's wedding, soldiers appear. I should go to them," Walks Between Worlds said, and immediately felt the tension in the teepee ratchet higher. "If they're looking for me—" "You go nowhere," Iron Wolf said firmly. "You are Lakota now. We do not surrender our people to the whites. But if my presence brings danger—" "Your presence brings many things," White Owl interrupted, his ancient voice carrying absolute authority. "Danger, perhaps, but also opportunity. You speak their language not just in words, but in understanding. This could be valuable. Or it could get us all killed, Spotted Eagle said bluntly. If they recognize him. They won't. Walks Between Worlds touched his face, feeling the changes that months of sun and wind had wrought. His skin was darker now, weathered to something approaching the tone of a mixed blood. His hair had grown long, worn in the Lakota style. The scars from his trials had changed the shape of his face, subtly but significantly. Daniel Harper had short hair, pale skin, no scars. I looked nothing like him now. Perhaps not to us, Red Crow said. But to them, all whites look alike to many of our people. Perhaps all Lakota look alike to them, but their own kind. It was a valid concern. Walks Between Worlds had known every man in his company by sight, could have recognized them years later despite changes. If any of these soldiers were from Fort Laramie, we need information, Iron Wolf decided. Send scouts to observe them more closely, determine their purpose. Until we know more, we prepare for both possibilities, peace and war. The band spent the next day in tense preparation. Women packed essential items in case they needed to flee quickly. Warriors checked weapons, prepared ammunition, painted their horses for war. Walks Between Worlds found himself in an impossible position, trusted enough to help with preparations, but aware that every person who looked at him wondered if he was the cause of the approaching danger. Ayanna worked beside him in grim silence, her usual gentle demeanor replaced by the focused intensity of someone who'd lived her entire life under the threat of military violence. When he tried to apologize for the danger, for the uncertainty, she cut him off with a sharp gesture. "You are my husband," she said simply. "Your dangers are my dangers. That is what marriage means. Even if those dangers come from my past. Especially then. You think I didn't know this was possible when I chose you? You think my father didn't consider it when he offered the marriage pact?" She touched his face gently. "We all knew. We chose anyway." That night, the scouts returned with troubling news. The soldiers had made camp at Ash Creek, only 10 miles from the band's current location. More concerning, they'd been asking questions at every trading post and friendly band about a white man living among the Lakota. "They're looking for me," Walks Between Worlds said flatly. There was no point in denying it. "They're looking for Daniel Harper," Iron Wolf corrected. "That man is dead. A distinction that might not matter if they find me." "Then we ensure they don't find you," White Owl said. "Tomorrow, Iron Wolf and several others will go to meet with them, determine their true purpose. You will remain here hidden." "That's cowardice," Walks Between Worlds protested. "Letting others face danger I brought." "That's wisdom," Red Crow interrupted, surprising everyone. "You are no use to us dead or captured. Your knowledge of their ways, their thinking, this is valuable, but only if you remain free to share it." The meeting was set for the next dawn neutral ground by the creek. Iron Wolf would take 5 warriors with him, enough to show strength, but not enough to seem threatening. Walks Between Worlds spent the night teaching them key phrases in English military protocol, the proper way to address an officer to show respect without showing submission. Remember, he told them, soldiers respect strength but fear unpredictability. Be firm, be clear, but give them no reason to think you're hiding something. "Even though we are hiding something," Spotted Eagle said dryly. "Especially because we're hiding something." He watched them ride out at dawn, his stomach churning with anxiety. Ayanna stood beside him, her hand in his. Both of them knowing that the next few hours would determine whether their new life together would survive its first real test. The waiting was agony. Every minute stretched like an hour. Every sound might be horses returning with news. The camp tried to maintain normal activities, but everyone was on edge, ready to fight or flee at a moment's notice. It was midday when the riders returned, and Walks Between Worlds knew immediately that something was wrong. Iron Wolf's face was stone, and Red Crow looked ready to kill someone. They dismounted in silence, gesturing for the council to gather. "The soldiers are led by a Captain Morrison," Iron Wolf announced once everyone had assembled. "He says they're on a peace mission establishing new treaty boundaries." "But," White Owl prompted, "but he asked many questions about a deserter, a Private Harper, who was reported dead but who some say lives among us." Iron Wolf's eyes found Walks Between Worlds. "He offered a reward for information. When we claimed ignorance, he said something interesting. What? He said that if this Harper was found living among the Lakota, it would prove that the bands cannot be trusted, that harboring deserters is an act of war. He gave us 3 days to produce Harper or face consequences. The TP erupted in angry voices. Some called for war immediately. Others argued for fleeing deeper into the hills. Still others suggested trying to negotiate. Through it all, Walks Between Worlds sat silent, his mind racing through possibilities. "There's more," Iron Wolf said, quieting the group.
Morrison had a man with him, Corporal Briggs. The blood drained from Walks Between Worlds' face. Briggs, the man whose harassment of Ayanna had started everything. The man whose jaw he'd broken, whose lies had led to 30 lashes. Of course, Briggs would be here. Of course, he'd be the one to hunt him down. "He knows," Walks Between Worlds said quietly.
"Briggs knows I'm here. He probably volunteered for this mission just to find me." "Then we fight," Spotted Eagle said immediately. 30 soldiers. We have 40 warriors. The numbers are ours." "And then what?" White Owl asked. "We kill 30 soldiers and they send 300, then 3,000. This is how it always goes." "So we run." Red Crow's voice dripped contempt. "Abandon our hunting grounds because they make threats. There's another way." Walks Between Worlds said slowly, an idea forming. "Give them what they want." Everyone turned to stare at him. "You would surrender." Ayanna's voice was small hurt. "No, I'd give them Daniel Harper." He stood pacing as he thought out loud. "They want proof that Harper is dead." "We give them proof. A body burned beyond recognition, but with Harper's effects. His journal, maybe some pieces of uniform I've kept." "And where do we get this body?" Iron Wolf asked. "We don't. We fake it. Wrap bones and meat in a burial scaffold, partially burn. It make it look like a traditional burial that was interrupted. I write final entries in the journal about dying from infection, being accepted by the band for burial. Briggs wants Harper dead. We show him Harper dead." "It might work," White Owl said thoughtfully, "but the risk is mine to take. I'll help prepare the false burial. If something goes wrong, I lead them away from the band." "No," Ayanna's voice was steel now. "We do this together, or not at all." The debate raged for hours. Some saw the deception as clever, others as too dangerous. Red Crow surprisingly supported the plan, arguing that deceiving enemies was an honored tradition in warfare. Finally, Iron Wolf made the decision. "We try the deception. If it fails, we fight. But we give peace a chance first." They worked through the night preparing the false burial site. The grandmother, with her knowledge of anatomy and decay, supervised the creation of a convincingly human-shaped bundle using deer bones and bear meat. Walks Between Worlds wrote final journal entries with his left hand to disguise his handwriting, describing Daniel Harper's final days. Fever dying shown mercy by the Lakota, who gave him traditional burial despite being white. The hardest part was adding authentic details. He had to include his army identification tags, a photograph of his mother he'd carried since leaving home, the small Bible his father had given him when he enlisted. Each item felt like another piece of his past being literally burned away. "Second thoughts?" Dakota asked, finding him staring at the photograph in the pre-dawn darkness. "No, just saying goodbye." He handed over the photograph. "Make sure this is partially visible in the wrappings. Briggs will recognize it. I showed it to everyone when I first arrived at the fort." They chose a burial site 5 miles from camp on a hill that overlooked the valley. It was a place the band had used before, dotted with other scaffolds in various states of decay. The false burial would look natural there, just another body returning to the earth. Spotted Eagle and several warriors had the unenviable task of making the deception look real. They partially burned the scaffold, making it appear that someone had attempted cremation but been interrupted. They scattered Harper's few remaining possessions around the site, a belt buckle buttons from his uniform pages from the journal torn and scattered by wind. When Morrison's deadline arrived, Iron Wolf rode out again this time to invite the captain to see what they'd discovered, the burial site of the man they'd been seeking. The gamble was immense. If Morrison, or especially Briggs, saw through the deception, it would confirm their worst suspicions about the band harboring a deserter. Walks Between Worlds watched from hiding as the soldiers were led to the burial site. He was concealed in a cluster of rocks, overlooking the hill, close enough to see but far enough to escape if necessary. Ayanna crouched beside him, an arrow nocked in her bow, ready to fight their way out if needed. Morrison dismounted, approaching the scaffold with professional interest. But it was Briggs who Walks Between Worlds watched most carefully. The corporal's face was a mask of anticipation that gradually shifted to disappointment as he examined the remains. "Could be anyone," Briggs said loudly enough for his voice to carry. "These savages," Corporal Morrison cut him off sharply. "Mind your tongue. We're guests here." Morrison spent long minutes examining the scene. He picked up pages from the journal reading Daniel's forged final words. He studied the photograph, compared it to something in his own pocket, probably a file on the deserter Harper. Finally, he approached the scaffold itself, examining the partially burned remains. "The identification tags," he called to Briggs. "They match our records." "Tags can be planted," Briggs protested. "This proves nothing." "This proves everything," Morrison replied coldly. "The man is dead, has been for months by the look of it. Your obsession with this deserter has cost the Army time and resources, Corporal." "Sir, I know Harper was here. The girl he defended—" "Enough!" Morrison's voice could have frozen flame. "Private Harper is dead. The matter is closed." He turned to Iron Wolf with what appeared to be genuine respect. "I apologize for the intrusion, Chief. It seems we were chasing ghosts. We'll trouble you no more." But Briggs wasn't done. His eyes swept the gathered Lakota, searching, and for one heart-stopping moment his gaze seemed to linger on the rocks where Walks Between Worlds hid. Then he turned away, mounting his horse with visible reluctance. The soldiers departed, but the tension didn't ease. They all knew Briggs wasn't convinced, even if his commanding officer was. The question was whether he'd accept Morrison's decision or continue his personal vendetta. The answer came 3 nights later. Walks Between Worlds woke to Ayanna's hand over his mouth, her eyes wide with alarm. She held up 3 fingers, then pointed outside. 3 men approaching their teepee, moving silently. Walks Between Worlds reached for his knife and the pistol he still kept, despite its association with his past. Ayanna had her bow and arrow already nocked. They positioned themselves on either side of the entrance, ready. The flap moved slightly, and a face appeared. Briggs. His features twisted with triumph. Behind him, 2 soldiers Walks Between Worlds didn't recognize. "I knew it," Briggs whispered harshly. "Harper, you traitorous bastard. Thought you could fool us with that burial nonsense." Walks Between Worlds stayed silent, assessing. 3 men, but were there more outside? Had they surrounded the teepee? The camp was quiet. No sounds of alarm. These 3 had come alone secretly. "Come out, Harper. Face justice like a man, not hiding behind savages and squaws." The slur against Ayanna decided it. Walks Between Worlds moved fast and silent, the knife finding Briggs's throat before the corporal could react. Not cutting, not yet, but pressing hard enough to draw a single drop of blood. "You're in my home," Walks Between Worlds said quietly in English. "In my camp, threatening my wife. Give me one reason not to open your throat." "Because killing us starts a war," one of the other soldiers said. "The captain doesn't know we're here, but when we don't return, he'll know something happened." "Or," Ayanna said, in surprisingly clear English, her arrow aimed at the speaking soldier's eye, "you disappear in the night, deserters like Harper, men who couldn't face frontier life. They'd never believe." "Wouldn't they, Hot?" Walks Between Worlds pressed the knife harder against Briggs's throat. A corporal obsessed with finding a dead deserter, convinced his commander is wrong, goes off on his own to prove it. Sounds like the kind of man who might desert himself when he fails. Briggs tried to speak, but the knife prevented much movement, his eyes though burned with hatred. "Here's what's going to happen." Walks Between Worlds continued. "You're going to leave. Tonight, you're going to tell Morrison you were wrong, that Harper is definitely dead. You're going to request transfer back east away from here. And you're never going to speak of this again." "And if we don't?" the 3rd soldier asked. "Then you don't leave this teepee alive, and tomorrow your scalps hang from Lakota lances. Your choice. It wasn't really a choice and they all knew it, but Briggs had to try one more time. You're a traitor, Harper, a disgrace to the uniform. The uniform I wore represents honor, courage, protection of the innocent. Walks between worlds interrupted. I upheld those values when I protected Ayanna from you. I uphold them now by choosing not to kill you, even though you deserve it. The only disgrace to the uniform here is you. He pulled the knife away, stepping back but keeping it ready. Go, now. Don't look back, don't return. Daniel Harper is dead. If you come looking for him again, Walks Between Worlds will ensure you join him. The three soldiers backed out of the teepee slowly. Walks Between Worlds and Ayanna followed them, watching as they retrieved their hidden horses and rode away into the darkness. Only when they were completely out of sight did Walks Between Worlds allow himself to breathe properly. They could still cause trouble, Ayanna said quietly. They could, but I don't think they will. Morrison already declared the matter closed. Briggs would have to admit to disobeying orders to pursue it further. He pulled her close. And something tells me those two soldiers with him won't support his story. They didn't seem eager to die for his obsession. Word of the night visit spread through the camp quickly. Iron Wolf was furious that soldiers had been able to infiltrate so easily and new guards were posted. But there was also a sense of relief the threat had passed, at least for now. Captain Morrison's patrol left the area 2 days later, heading north toward the next band. Scouts reported that Briggs was with them, but subdued, no longer pushing his theories about Harper being alive. Within a month, word came through the trading post that Briggs had indeed requested and received a transfer to a fort in Arizona far from Lakota lands. It's over then, Ayanna said one evening as they watched the sunset paint the sky crimson. That threat is over. Walks Between Worlds corrected. There will be others. As long as there's tension between our peoples, my presence here will be complicated. Regrets. He thought about it seriously, as he always did when she asked. His life was harder now than it had been as a soldier. The constant physical demands of survival, the cultural navigation required to be accepted. The knowledge that he'd forever be caught between worlds. None of it was easy. But then he looked at Ayanna, her face glowing in the sunset light, her hand resting on her still flat belly, where their child grew, a discovery from just days ago that they hadn't yet shared with others. This child would be the ultimate bridge between worlds, carrying the blood of both peoples. No regrets, he said firmly. Never regrets. 3 months passed in relative peace. Walks Between Worlds settled into the rhythm of band life, hunting, scouting, participating in ceremonies. His Lakota became fluent enough that sometimes he forgot English words, having to pause and think when traders visited who spoke only English. The band moved with the seasons, following game and good weather. Walks Between Worlds. Learned to read the land in ways he'd never imagined as a soldier, how the flight of birds could predict storms, how the behavior of ants indicated water sources, how the wind carried stories if you knew how to listen. His relationship with the other warriors evolved from suspicious tolerance to genuine friendship. Even Spotted Eagle, once his harshest critic, now treated him as a true brother in arms. They hunted together, trained together, shared stories around the fire. You're different from what I expected, Spotted Eagle admitted one day as they tracked elk through early snow. What did you expect? Weakness, softness, the inability to let go of white ways. He paused, reading signs in the disturbed snow. But you've released your past completely. Not completely. Walks Between Worlds corrected. I've integrated it. The military training helps me understand tactical thinking. The literacy lets me read treaties and documents for the band. The knowledge of white culture helps us navigate trade and negotiation. So you're using your white knowledge to help the Lakota. I'm using all my knowledge to help my people. The Lakota are my people now. Spotted Eagle was quiet for a moment, then said, Ayanna is with child. It wasn't a question. Walks Between Worlds had learned that privacy was different in the band. Everyone knew everything eventually. Yes. The child will be mixed blood. That will bring challenges. I know. Good. Knowing is the first step to preparing. Spotted Eagle pointed to fresh tracks. Elk went this way. But see how the stride changes. It's wounded. We're close. They found the elk an hour later, brought down by another predator, but escaped. Walks Between Worlds made the killing shot with an arrow, having long ago retired the pistol except for emergencies. As they prepared the carcass for transport, Spotted Eagle spoke again. My sister had a mixed-blood child once, from a trader who promised marriage but disappeared. The child faced hardship from both worlds, too white for some Lakota, too Indian for any whites. What happened to the child? She became one of our strongest warriors. The challenges made her stronger. He looked at Walks Between Worlds meaningfully. Your child will need that strength. That night, Walks Between Worlds and Ayanna formally announced her pregnancy to the band. The celebration was immediate, and genuine children were always a blessing regardless of their parentage. The grandmother immediately began preparing medicines and charms for a healthy pregnancy, while the women started work on a cradle board and tiny moccasins. Iron Wolf was particularly pleased seeing in this child the possibility he'd hoped for a living bridge between worlds. This child will know both languages from birth, he said, both cultures, both strengths. Perhaps this child will help prevent the wars we see coming. That's a heavy burden for someone not yet born, Walks Between Worlds pointed out. All children carry the burdens and hopes of their parents. This one just carries more than most. Winter settled over the plains with unusual severity that year. The snows came early and heavy, making hunting difficult and travel nearly impossible. The band huddled in their winter camp, rationing food, carefully waiting for the weather to break. It was during the worst blizzard that the second crisis came. Scouts reported a group struggling through the snow toward their camp. Not soldiers, but civilians. As they got closer, details emerged that made Walks Between Worlds' blood run cold. It was a family of settlers, their wagon broken, obviously lost and freezing. The band was divided on what to do. Some argued for helping them. The Lakota tradition of hospitality demanded it. Others, led by Red Crow, argued that helping whites would only bring more trouble. Let them freeze, Red Crow said bluntly. How many of our people have frozen because whites drove us from warm lands? Children don't choose their birth, White Owl countered. The scouts report young ones with them. All eyes turned to Walks Between Worlds, the bridge between worlds. His decision would carry weight. He thought of the code he'd learned as a soldier, never leave anyone behind. He thought of the Lakota values of compassion and hospitality. He thought of his own child growing in Ayanna's womb, who would need a world with more mercy than either people had shown so far. We help them, he said firmly. Not as Lakota helping whites, but as humans helping humans. That's the only way forward. The rescue was difficult. The family, a man, woman, and 3 children, were near death from exposure. They'd been trying to reach a trading post but had gotten completely lost in the blizzard. Their reaction when Lakota warriors appeared out of the snow was terror turning to desperate gratitude. Walks Between Worlds served as translator, his appearance clearly white features despite his Lakota clothing helping calm their fears. The family was brought to the camp, given shelter in a spare teepee, treated for frostbite and exposure. The man who gave his name as Thomas Bryant was a school teacher from Illinois, bringing his family west for opportunity. His wife Sarah had medical training as a midwife. Their children, 2 boys and a girl, were between 5 and 12 years old. Over the next weeks, as the blizzard continued and strange relationship developed, the Bryants, initially terrified, began to see the Lakota as people rather than savages. The children played together despite the language barrier. Sarah helped the grandmother with medical treatments, sharing knowledge that transcended cultural boundaries. And Walks Between Worlds found himself in his element, translating not just words but cultures, helping each side see the humanity in the other. You're not what I expected, Thomas told him one evening as they shared a pipe the teacher had been honored with invitation to the men's circle. What did you expect? A captive, I suppose, or a man gone savage. Thomas looked embarrassed. The stories we hear in the East are mostly lies, or truths so twisted they might as well be lies. Walks Between Worlds paused. Though the same is true of stories told here about whites, both sides prefer demons to humans. It's easier to kill demons. Yet you chose to live here, to become one of them. I chose to become who I was meant to be. That happened to be here with these people with my wife. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Your wife, she's beautiful and clearly devoted to you, as I am to her. The child she carries, it will be mixed blood. Yes. That will be difficult. I've seen how mixed blood children are treated in white towns. Which is why our child will be raised here, where they'll be valued for who they are, not rejected for what they are. When the weather finally broke and the Bryants could travel, the parting was surprisingly emotional. Sarah hugged Ayanna, promising to spread word that the Lakota were not the monsters of popular imagination. The children exchanged small gifts with their new friends. Thomas shook Walks Between Worlds' hand firmly. You've changed my perspective on everything. If there were more men like you bridging our worlds, perhaps there'd be less bloodshed. Perhaps. But bridges require both sides to want to cross. As the Bryant family departed, guided by warriors to the nearest trading post, Iron Wolf stood beside his adopted son. You did well. You showed them we are not what they feared. And they showed our people that not all whites are enemies. Some are, though. Never forget that. The Bryants are good people, but they're not the ones making policy in Washington. It was a sobering reminder. Individual kindness couldn't overcome systematic injustice. But it was a start, a small flame of hope in the darkness of approaching conflict. Spring arrived with Ayanna's belly rounding with life. The band had moved to summer hunting grounds following the buffalo herds that were noticeably smaller than even the previous year. The pressure from white hunters, the railroad expansion, the military patrols, all of it was shrinking the world the Lakota knew. It was during a hunt that the third crisis arose. Walks Between Worlds was with a hunting party tracking a small buffalo herd when they encountered another group white buffalo hunters, the kind who killed for hides and left the meat to rot. There were 6 of them armed with powerful rifles, and they'd already killed dozens of buffalo, taking only the hides. The waste was obscene, an insult to everything the Lakota believed about respectful hunting. The younger warriors wanted to attack immediately to punish this desecration, but Walks Between Worlds counseled caution. They have repeating rifles. We're outnumbered and outgunned. So we do nothing. Spotted Eagle's voice was tight with rage. We do something smarter. His plan was risky, but played to their strengths. They waited until nightfall, then crept into the hunters' camp. Instead of attacking the men, they destroyed their equipment, cut their wagon wheels, spoiled their ammunition, with water released their horses. When the hunters woke, they were stranded on the prairie with no way to transport their hides, no way to continue their slaughter. Walks Between Worlds left a note written in English. The buffalo are not yours to waste. Leave now on foot and live. Stay and face the consequences. The hunters, faced with the reality of their situation, chose to walk out. It took them 5 days to reach the nearest town, arriving sunburned, exhausted, and humiliated. They told stories of savage attacks, but the physical evidence they were unharmed while their equipment was precisely destroyed told a different story. Word of the incident spread, carried by traders and travelers. Some whites were outraged at the Indian aggression. Others, particularly those who understood the plains ecosystem, quietly approved of stopping the wasteful slaughter. For Walks Between Worlds. It was another successful navigation between worlds, using his understanding of white psychology to achieve Lakota goals without triggering the violent retaliation that direct attack would have brought.